Summer by Edith Wharton. Chapter 1. A girl came out of Lawyer Royal's house at the end of the one street of North Dormer and stood on the doorstep. It was the beginning of a June afternoon. The spring-like transparent sky shed a rain of silver sunshine on the roofs of the village and on the pastures and larch-woods surrounding it. A little wind moved among the round white clouds on the shoulders of the hills, driving their shadows across the fields and down the grassy road that takes the name of street when it passes through North Dormer. The place lies high and in the open, and lacks the lavish shade of the more protected New England villages. The clump of weeping willows about the duck-pond, and the Norway spruces in front of the Hatchard gate, cast almost the only roadside shadow between Lawyer Royal's house and the point where, at the other end of the village, the road rises above the church and skirts the black hemlock wall enclosing the cemetery. The little June wind, frisking down the street, shook the doleful fringes of the Hatchard spruces, caught the straw hat of a young man just passing under them, and spun it clean across the road into the duck-pond. As he ran to fish it out, the girl on Lawyer Royal's doorstep noticed that he was a stranger, that he wore city clothes, and that he was laughing with all his teeth, as the young and careless laugh at such mishaps. Her heart contracted a little, and the shrinking that sometimes came over her when she saw people with holiday faces made her draw back into the house and pretend to look for the key that she knew she had already put into her pocket. A narrow greenish mirror with a gilt eagle over it hung on the passage wall, and she looked critically at her reflection, wished for the 1000th time that she had blue eyes like Annabel Balch, the girl who sometimes came from Springfield to spend a week with old Miss Hatchard, straightened the sunburnt hat over her small swarthy face, and turned out again into the sunshine. "How I hate everything," she murmured. The young man had passed through the Hatchard gate, and she had the street to herself. North Dormer is at all times an empty place, and at 3 o'clock on a June afternoon its few able-bodied men are off in the fields or woods, and the women indoors, engaged in languid household drudgery. The girl walked along, swinging her key on a finger, and looked about her with the heightened attention produced by the presence of a stranger in a familiar place. What, she wondered, did North Dormer look like to people from other parts of the world? She herself had lived there since the age of 5, and had long supposed it to be a place of some importance. But about a year before, Mr. Miles, the new Episcopal clergyman at Hepburn, who drove over every other Sunday, when the roads were not ploughed up by hauling, to hold a service in the North Dormer church, had proposed, in a fit of missionary zeal, to take the young people down to Nettleton to hear an illustrated lecture on the Holy Land, and the dozen girls and boys who represented the future of North Dormer had been piled into a farm-wagon, driven over the hills to Hepburn, put into a way-train, and carried to Nettleton. In the course of that incredible day Charity Royal had, for the first and only time, experienced railway travel, looked into shops with plate-glass fronts, tasted cocoanut pie, sat in a theatre, and listened to a gentleman saying unintelligible things before pictures that she would have enjoyed looking at if his explanations had not prevented her from understanding them. This initiation had shown her that North Dormer was a small place, and developed in her a thirst for information that her position as custodian of the village library had previously failed to excite. For a month or two she dipped feverishly and disconnectedly into the dusty volumes of the Hatchard Memorial Library. Then the impression of Nettleton began to fade, and she found it easier to take North Dormer as the norm of the universe than to go on reading. The sight of the stranger once more revived memories of Nettleton, and North Dormer shrank to its real size. As she looked up and down it, from Lawyer Royal's faded red house at one end to the white church at the other, she pitilessly took its measure. There it lay, a weather-beaten, sunburnt village of the hills, abandoned of men, left apart by railway, trolley, telegraph, and all the forces that link life to life in modern communities. It had no shops, no theatres, no lectures, no business block, only a church that was opened every other Sunday, if the state of the roads permitted, and a library for which no new books had been bought for 20 years, and where the old ones mouldered undisturbed on the damp shelves. Yet Charity Royal had always been told that she ought to consider it a privilege that her lot had been cast in North Dormer. She knew that, compared to the place she had come from, North Dormer represented all the blessings of the most refined civilization. Every one in the village had told her so ever since she had been brought there as a child. Even old Miss Hatchard had said to her, on a terrible occasion in her life, "My child, you must never cease to remember that it was Mr. Royal who brought you down from the mountain." She had been brought down from the mountain, from the scarred cliff that lifted its sullen wall above the lesser slopes of Eagle Range, making a perpetual background of gloom to the lonely valley. The mountain was a good 15 miles away, but it rose so abruptly from the lower hills that it seemed almost to cast its shadow over North Dormer, and it was like a great magnet drawing the clouds and scattering them in storm across the valley. If ever, in the purest summer sky, there trailed a thread of vapour over North Dormer, it drifted to the mountain as a ship drifts to a whirlpool, and was caught among the rocks, torn up and multiplied, to sweep back over the village in rain and darkness. Charity was not very clear about the mountain, but she knew it was a bad place, and a shame to have come from, and that whatever befell her in North Dormer, she ought, as Miss Hatchard had once reminded her, to remember that she had been brought down from there, and hold her tongue, and be thankful. She looked up at the mountain, thinking of these things, and tried as usual to be thankful. But the sight of the young man turning in at Miss Hatchard's gate had brought back the vision of the glittering streets of Nettleton, and she felt ashamed of her old sun-hat, and sick of North Dormer, and jealously aware of Annabel Balch of Springfield, opening her blue eyes somewhere far off, on glories greater than the glories of Nettleton. "How I hate everything," she said again. Halfway down the street she stopped at a weak-hinged gate. Passing through it, she walked down a brick path to a queer little brick temple with white wooden columns supporting a pediment on which was inscribed in tarnished gold letters, "The Honorius Hatchard Memorial Library, 1832." Honorius Hatchard had been old Miss Hatchard's great-uncle, though she would undoubtedly have reversed the phrase, and put forward, as her only claim to distinction, the fact that she was his great-niece. For Honorius Hatchard, in the early years of the 19th century, had enjoyed a modest celebrity. As the marble tablet in the interior of the library informed its infrequent visitors, he had possessed marked literary gifts, written a series of papers called The Recluse of Eagle Range, enjoyed the acquaintance of Washington Irving and Fitz-Greene Halleck, and been cut off in his flower by a fever contracted in Italy. Such had been the sole link between North Dormer and literature, a link piously commemorated by the erection of the monument where Charity Royal, every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, sat at her desk under a freckled steel engraving of the deceased author, and wondered if he felt any deader in his grave than she did in his library. Entering her prison-house with a listless step, she took off her hat, hung it on a plaster bust of Minerva, opened the shutters, leaned out to see if there were any eggs in the swallow's nest above one of the windows, and finally, seating herself behind the desk, drew out a roll of cotton lace and a steel crochet-hook. She was not an expert workwoman, and it had taken her many weeks to make the half-yard of narrow lace which she kept wound about the buckram back of a disintegrated copy of The Lamplighter. But there was no other way of getting any lace to trim her summer blouse, and since Ally Hawes, the poorest girl in the village, had shown herself in church with enviable transparencies about the shoulders, Charity's hook had travelled faster. She unrolled the lace, dug the hook into a loop, and bent to the task with furrowed brows. Suddenly the door opened, and before she had raised her eyes, she knew that the young man she had seen going in at the Hatchard gate had entered the library. Without taking any notice of her, he began to move slowly about the long, vault-like room, his hands behind his back, his short-sighted eyes peering up and down the rows of rusty bindings. At length he reached the desk, and stood before her. "Have you a card catalogue?" he asked in a pleasant, abrupt voice, and the oddness of the question caused her to drop her work. "A what?" "Why, you know—" He broke off, and she became conscious that he was looking at her for the first time, having apparently, on his entrance, included her in his general short-sighted survey as part of the furniture of the library. The fact that, in discovering her, he had lost the thread of his remark did not escape her attention, and she looked down and smiled. He smiled also. "No, I don't suppose you do know," he corrected himself. "In fact, it would be almost a pity." She thought she detected a slight condescension in his tone, and asked sharply, "Why?" "Because it's so much pleasanter in a small library like this to poke about by oneself, with the help of the librarian." He added the last phrase so respectfully that she was mollified, and rejoined with a sigh, "I'm afraid I can't help you much." "Why?" he questioned in his turn, and she replied that there weren't many books anyhow, and that she'd hardly read any of them. "The worms are getting at them," she added gloomily. "Are they? That's a pity, for I see there are some good ones." He seemed to have lost interest in their conversation, and strolled away again, apparently forgetting her. His indifference nettled her, and she picked up her work, resolved not to offer him the least assistance. Apparently he did not need it, for he spent a long time with his back to her, lifting down, one after another, the tall cobwebby volumes from a distant shelf. "Oh, I say!" he exclaimed, and looking up she saw that he had drawn out his handkerchief and was carefully wiping the edges of the book in his hand. The action struck her as an unwarranted criticism of her care of the books, and she said irritably, "It's not my fault if they're dirty." He turned around and looked at her with reviving interest. "Ah, then you're not the librarian?" "Of course I am, but I can't dust all these books. Besides, nobody ever looks at them, now Miss Hatchard's too lame to come round." "No, I suppose not." He laid down the book he had been wiping, and stood considering her in silence. She wondered if Miss Hatchard had sent him round to pry into the way the library was looked after, and the suspicion increased her resentment. "I saw you going into her house just now, didn't I?" she asked, with the New England avoidance of the proper name. She was determined to find out why he was poking about among her books. "Miss Hatchard's house? Yes, she's my cousin, and I'm staying there," the young man answered, adding, as if to disarm a visible distrust, "My name is Harney, Lucius Harney. She may have spoken of me." "No, she hasn't," said Charity, wishing she could have said, "Yes, she has." "Oh, well," said Miss Hatchard's cousin with a laugh, and after another pause, during which it occurred to Charity that her answer had not been encouraging, he remarked, "You don't seem strong on architecture." Her bewilderment was complete. The more she wished to appear to understand him, the more unintelligible his remarks became. He reminded her of the gentleman who had "explained" the pictures at Nettleton, and the weight of her ignorance settled down on her again like a pall. "I mean, I can't see that you have any books on the old houses about here. I suppose, for that matter, this part of the country hasn't been much explored. They all go on doing Plymouth and Salem. So stupid. My cousin's house, now, is remarkable. This place must have had a past. It must have been more of a place once." He stopped short, with the blush of a shy man who overhears himself, and fears he has been voluble. "I'm an architect, you see, and I'm hunting up old houses in these parts." She stared. "Old houses? Everything's old in North Dormer, isn't it? The folks are, anyhow." He laughed and wandered away again. "Haven't you any kind of history of the place? I think there was one written about 1840, a book or pamphlet about its first settlement," he said presently, from the farther end of the room. She pressed her crochet hook against her lip and pondered. There was such a work, she knew, North Dormer and the Early Townships of Eagle County. She had a special grudge against it, because it was a limp, weekly book that was always either falling off the shelf or slipping back and disappearing if one squeezed it in between sustaining volumes. She remembered the last time she had picked it up, wondering how anyone could have taken the trouble to write a book about North Dormer and its neighbours, Dormer, Hamblin, Creston, and Creston River. She knew them all, mere lost clusters of houses in the folds of the desolate ridges. Dormer, where North Dormer went for its apples, Creston River, where there used to be a paper mill, and its grey walls stood decaying by the stream, and Hamblin, where the first snow always fell. Such were their titles to fame. She got up and began to move about vaguely before the shelves, but she had no idea where she had last put the book, and something told her that it was going to play her its usual trick and remain invisible. It was not one of her lucky days. "I guess it's somewhere," she said, to prove her zeal, but she spoke without conviction, and felt that her words conveyed none. "Oh, well," he said again. She knew he was going, and wished more than ever to find the book. "It'll be for next time," he added, and picking up the volume he had laid on the desk, he handed it to her. "By the way, a little air and sun would do this good. It's rather valuable." He gave her a nod and smile, and passed out. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Summer, by Edith Wharton. The hours of the Hatchard Memorial Librarian were from 3 to 5, and Charity Royal's sense of duty usually kept her at her desk until nearly 4:30. But she had never perceived that any practical advantage thereby accrued either to North Dormer or to herself, and she had no scruple in decreeing, when it suited her, that the library should close an hour earlier. A few minutes after Mr. Harney's departure, she formed this decision, put away her lace, fastened the shutters, and turned the key in the door of the Temple of Knowledge. The street upon which she emerged was still empty, and after glancing up and down it, she began to walk toward her house. But instead of entering, she passed on, turned into a field path, and mounted to a pasture on the hillside. She let down the bars of the gate, followed a trail along the crumbling wall of the pasture, and walked on, till she reached a knoll where a clump of larches shook out their fresh tassels to the wind. There she lay down on the slope, tossed off her hat, and hid her face in the grass. She was blind and insensible to many things, and dimly knew it, but to all that was light and air, perfume and colour, every drop of blood in her responded. She loved the roughness of the dry mountain grass under her palms, the smell of the thyme into which she crushed her face, the fingering of the wind in her hair and through her cotton blouse, and the creak of the larches as they swayed to it. She often climbed up the hill and lay there alone for the mere pleasure of feeling the wind and of rubbing her cheeks in the grass. Generally at such times she did not think of anything, but lay immersed in an inarticulate well-being. To-day the sense of well-being was intensified by her joy at escaping from the library. She liked well enough to have a friend drop in and talk to her while she was on duty, but she hated to be bothered about books. How could she remember where they were, when they were so seldom asked for? Orma Fry occasionally took out a novel, and her brother Ben was fond of what he called "jography," and of books relating to trade and bookkeeping, but no one else asked for anything, except at intervals Uncle Tom's Cabin, or Opening of a Chestnut Burr, or Longfellow. She had these under her hand, and could have found them in the dark, but unexpected demands came so rarely that they exasperated her like an injustice. She had liked the young man's looks, and his short-sighted eyes, and his odd way of speaking that was abrupt yet soft, just as his hands were sunburnt and sinewy, yet with smooth nails like a woman's. His hair was sunburnt-looking too, or rather the colour of bracken after frost, his eyes grey, with the appealing look of the short-sighted, his smile shy yet confident, as if he knew lots of things she had never dreamed of, and yet wouldn't for the world have had her feel his superiority. But she did feel it, and liked the feeling, for it was new to her. Poor and ignorant as she was, and knew herself to be, humblest of the humble even in North Dormer, where to come from the mountain was the worst disgrace, yet in her narrow world she had always ruled. It was partly, of course, owing to the fact that Lawyer Royal was the biggest man in North Dormer, so much too big for it, in fact, that outsiders, who didn't know, always wondered how it held him. In spite of everything, and in spite even of Miss Hatchard, Lawyer Royal ruled in North Dormer, and Charity ruled in Lawyer Royal's house. She had never put it to herself in those terms, but she knew her power, knew what it was made of, and hated it. Confusedly, the young man in the library had made her feel for the first time what might be the sweetness of dependence. She sat up, brushed the bits of grass from her hair, and looked down on the house where she held sway. It stood just below her, cheerless and untended, its faded red front divided from the road by a yard with a path bordered by gooseberry bushes, a stone well overgrown with traveller's joy, and a sickly crimson rambler tied to a fan-shaped support, which Mr. Royal had once brought up from Hepburn to please her. Behind the house a bit of uneven ground with clothesline strung across it stretched up to a dry wall, and beyond the wall a patch of corn and a few rows of potatoes strayed vaguely into the adjoining wilderness of rock and fern. Charity could not recall her first sight of the house. She had been told that she was ill of a fever when she was brought down from the mountain, and she could only remember waking one day in a cot at the foot of Mrs. Royal's bed, and opening her eyes on the cold neatness of the room that was afterward to be hers. Mrs. Royal died 7 or 8 years later, and by that time Charity had taken the measure of most things about her. She knew that Mrs. Royal was sad and timid and weak. She knew that Lawyer Royal was harsh and violent, and still weaker. She knew that she had been christened Charity, in the white church at the other end of the village, to commemorate Mr. Royal's disinterestedness in bringing her down, and to keep alive in her a becoming sense of her dependence. She knew that Mr. Royal was her guardian, but that he had not legally adopted her, though everybody spoke of her as Charity Royal, and she knew why he had come back to live at North Dormer instead of practising at Nettleton, where he had begun his legal career. After Mrs. Royal's death there was some talk of sending her to a boarding school. Miss Hatchard suggested it, and had a long conference with Mr. Royal, who, in pursuance of her plan, departed one day for Starkfield to visit the institution she recommended. He came back the next night with a black face, worse, Charity observed, than she had ever seen him, and by that time she had had some experience. When she asked him how soon she was to start, he answered shortly, "You ain't goin'," and shut himself up in the room he called his office, and the next day the lady who kept the school at Starkfield wrote that, under the circumstances, she was afraid she could not make room just then for another pupil. Charity was disappointed, but she understood. It wasn't the temptations of Starkfield that had been Mr. Royal's undoing, it was the thought of losing her. He was a dreadfully lonesome man. She had made that out because she was so lonesome herself. He and she, face to face in that sad house, had sounded the depths of isolation, and though she felt no particular affection for him, and not the slightest gratitude, she pitied him, because she was conscious that he was superior to the people about him, and that she was the only being between him and solitude. Therefore, when Miss Hatchard sent for her a day or two later to talk of a school at Nettleton, and to say that this time a friend of hers would make the necessary arrangements, Charity cut her short with the announcement that she had decided not to leave North Dormer. Miss Hatchard reasoned with her kindly, but to no purpose. She simply repeated, "I guess Mr. Royal's too lonesome." Miss Hatchard blinked perplexedly behind her eye-glasses. Her long, frail face was full of puzzled wrinkles, and she leant forward, resting her hands on the arms of her mahogany armchair, with the evident desire to say something that ought to be said. "The feeling does you credit, my dear." She looked about the pale walls of her sitting-room, seeking counsel of ancestral daguerreotypes and didactic samplers, but they seemed to make utterance more difficult. "The fact is, it's not only because of the advantages. There are other reasons. You're too young to understand." "Oh, no, I ain't," said Charity harshly, and Miss Hatchard blushed to the roots of her blonde cap. But she must have felt a vague relief at having her explanation cut short, for she concluded, again invoking the daguerreotypes, "Of course I shall always do what I can for you, and in case, you know you can always come to me." Lawyer Royal was waiting for Charity in the porch when she returned from this visit. He had shaved, and brushed his black coat, and looked a magnificent monument of a man. At such moments she really admired him. "Well," he said, "is it settled?" "Yes, it's settled. I ain't goin'." "Not to the Nettleton school?" "Not anywhere." He cleared his throat and asked sternly, "Why?" "I'd rather not," she said, swinging past him on her way to her room. It was the following week that he brought her up the Crimson Rambler and its fan from Hepburn. He had never given her anything before. The next outstanding incident of her life had happened 2 years later, when she was 17. Lawyer Royal, who hated to go to Nettleton, had been called there in connection with a case. He still exercised his profession, though litigation languished in North Dormer and its outlying hamlets, and for once he had had an opportunity that he could not afford to refuse. He spent 3 days in Nettleton, won his case, and came back in high good humour. It was a rare mood with him, and manifested itself on this occasion by his talking impressively at the supper-table of the rousing welcome his old friends had given him. He wound up confidentially. "I was a damn fool ever to leave Nettleton. It was Mrs. Royal that made me do it." Charity immediately perceived that something bitter had happened to him, and that he was trying to talk down the recollection. She went up to bed early, leaving him seated in moody thought, his elbows propped on the worn oilcloth of the supper-table. On the way up she had extracted from his overcoat pocket the key of the cupboard where the bottle of whisky was kept. She was awakened by a rattling at her door, and jumped out of bed. She heard Mr. Royal's voice, low and peremptory, and opened the door, fearing an accident. No other thought had occurred to her, but when she saw him in the doorway, a ray from the autumn moon falling on his discomposed face, she understood. For a moment they looked at each other in silence. Then, as he put his foot across the threshold, she stretched out her arm and stopped him. "You go right back from here," she said, in a shrill voice that startled her. "You ain't going to have that key tonight." "Charity, let me in. I don't want the key. I'm a lonesome man," he began, in the deep voice that sometimes moved her. Her heart gave a startled plunge, but she continued to hold him back contemptuously. "Well, I guess you made a mistake, then. This ain't your wife's room any longer." She was not frightened, she simply felt a deep disgust, and perhaps he divined it, or read it in her face, for after staring at her a moment he drew back and turned slowly away from the door. With her ear to her keyhole she heard him feel his way down the dark stairs and toward the kitchen, and she listened for the crash of the cupboard panel, but instead she heard him, after an interval, unlock the door of the house, and his heavy steps came to her through the silence as he walked down the path. She crept to the window, and saw his bent figure striding up the road in the moonlight. Then a belated sense of fear came to her with the consciousness of victory, and she slipped into bed, cold to the bone. A day or two later poor Eudora Sceffe, who for 20 years had been the custodian of the Hatchard Library, died suddenly of pneumonia, and the day after the funeral Charity went to see Miss Hatchard and asked to be appointed librarian. The request seemed to surprise Miss Hatchard. She evidently questioned the new candidate's qualifications. "Why, I don't know, my dear. Aren't you rather too young?" She hesitated. "I want to earn some money," Charity merely answered. "Doesn't Mr. Royal give you all you require? No one is rich in North Dormer." "I want to earn money enough to get away." "To get away?" Miss Hatchard's puzzled wrinkles deepened, and there was a distressful pause. "You want to leave Mr. Royal?" "Yes, or I want another woman in the house with me," said Charity resolutely. Miss Hatchard clasped her nervous hands about the arms of her chair. Her eyes invoked the faded countenances on the wall, and after a faint cough of indecision she brought out, "The housework's too hard for you, I suppose?" Charity's heart grew cold. She understood that Miss Hatchard had no help to give her, and that she would have to fight her way out of her difficulty alone. A deeper sense of isolation overcame her. She felt incalculably old. "She's got to be talked to like a baby," she thought, with a feeling of compassion for Miss Hatchard's long immaturity. "Yes, that's it," she said aloud. "The housework's too hard for me. I've been coughing a good deal this fall." She noted the immediate effect of this suggestion. Miss Hatchard paled at the memory of poor Eudora's taking off, and promised to do what she could. But of course there were people she must consult, the clergyman, the selectmen of North Dormer, and a distant Hatchard relative at Springfield. "If you'd only gone to school," she sighed. She followed Charity to the door, and there, in the security of the threshold, said with a glance of evasive appeal, "I know Mr. Royal is trying at times, but his wife bore with him, and you must always remember, Charity, that it was Mr. Royal who brought you down from the mountain." Charity went home and opened the door of Mr. Royal's office. He was sitting there by the stove reading Daniel Webster's speeches. They had met at meals during the 5 days that had elapsed since he had come to her door, and she had walked at his side at Eudora's funeral, but they had not spoken a word to each other. He glanced up in surprise as she entered, and she noticed that he was unshaved, and that he looked unusually old, but as she had always thought of him as an old man, the change in his appearance did not move her. She told him she had been to see Miss Hatchard, and with what object. She saw that he was astonished, but he made no comment. "I told her the housework was too hard for me, and I wanted to earn the money to pay for a hired girl. But I ain't going to pay for her. You've got to. I want to have some money of my own." Mr. Royal's bushy black eyebrows were drawn together in a frown, and he sat drumming with ink-stained nails on the edge of his desk. "What do you want to earn money for?" he asked. "So's to get away when I want to." "Why do you want to get away?" Her contempt flashed out. "Do you suppose anybody'd stay at North Dormer if they could help it? You wouldn't, folks say." With lowered head he asked, "Where'd you go to?" "Anywhere I can earn my living. I'll try here first, and if I can't do it here I'll go somewhere else. I'll go up the mountain if I have to." She paused on this threat, and saw that it had taken effect. "I want you should get Miss Hatchard and the selectmen to take me at the library, and I want a woman here in the house with me," she repeated. Mr. Royal had grown exceedingly pale. When she ended he stood up ponderously, leaning against the desk, and for a second or two they looked at each other. "See here," he said at length, as though utterance were difficult. "There's something I've been wanting to say to you. I'd ought to have said it before. I want you to marry me." The girl still stared at him without moving. "I want you to marry me," he repeated, clearing his throat. "The minister'll be up here next Sunday, and we can fix it up then. Or I'll drive you down to Hepburn to the justice and get it done there. I'll do whatever you say." His eyes fell under the merciless stare she continued to fix on him, and he shifted his weight uneasily from one foot to the other. As he stood there before her, unwieldy, shabby, disordered, the purple veins distorting the hands he pressed against the desk, and his long orator's jaw trembling with the effort of his avowal, he seemed like a hideous parody of the fatherly old man she had always known. "Marry you? Me?" she burst out with a scornful laugh. "Was that what you came to ask me the other night? What's come over you, I wonder? How long is it since you've looked at yourself in the glass?" She straightened herself, insolently conscious of her youth and strength. "I suppose you think it would be cheaper to marry me than to keep a hired girl. Everybody knows you're the closest man in Eagle County, but I guess you're not going to get your mending done for you that way twice." Mr. Royal did not move while she spoke. His face was ash-coloured, and his black eyebrows quivered as though the blaze of her scorn had blinded him. When she ceased, he held up his hand. "That'll do. That'll about do," he said. He turned to the door and took his hat from the hat-peg. On the threshold he paused. "People ain't been fair to me. From the first they ain't been fair to me," he said. Then he went out. A few days later, North Dormer learned with surprise that Charity had been appointed librarian of the Hatchard Memorial at a salary of $8 a month, and that old Verena Marsh, from the Creston almshouse, was coming to live at Lawyer Royal's and do the cooking. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Summer. It was not in the room known at the Red House as Mr. Royal's office that he received his infrequent clients. Professional dignity and masculine independence made it necessary that he should have a real office, under a different roof, and his standing as the only lawyer of North Dormer required that the roof should be the same as that which sheltered the town hall and the post office. It was his habit to walk to this office twice a day, morning and afternoon. It was on the ground floor of the building, with a separate entrance, and a weathered name-plate on the door. Before going in he stepped into the post office for his mail, usually an empty ceremony, said a word or two to the town clerk, who sat across the passage in idle state, and then went over to the store on the opposite corner, where Carrick Fry, the storekeeper, always kept a chair for him, and where he was sure to find one or two select men leaning on the long counter, in an atmosphere of rope, leather, tar, and coffee-beans. Mr. Royal, though monosyllabic at home, was not averse in certain moods to imparting his views to his fellow-townsmen. Perhaps also he was unwilling that his rare clients should surprise him sitting, clerkless and unoccupied, in his dusty office. At any rate, his hours there were not much longer or more regular than Charity's at the library. The rest of his time he spent either at the store or in driving about the country on business connected with the insurance companies that he represented, or in sitting at home reading Bancroft's History of the United States and the speeches of Daniel Webster. Since the day when Charity had told him that she wished to succeed to Eudora Skeff's post, their relations had undefinably but definitely changed. Lawyer Royal had kept his word. He had obtained the place for her at the cost of considerable manoeuvring, as she guessed from the number of rival candidates, and from the acerbity with which two of them, Orma Fry and the eldest Target girl, treated her for nearly a year afterward. And he had engaged Verena Marsh to come up from Creston and do the cooking. Verena was a poor old widow, doddering and shiftless. Charity suspected that she came for her keep. Mr. Royal was too close a man to give $1 a day to a smart girl when he could get a deaf pauper for nothing. But at any rate Verena was there, in the attic just over Charity, and the fact that she was deaf did not greatly trouble the young girl. Charity knew that what had happened on that hateful night would not happen again. She understood that, profoundly as she had despised Mr. Royal ever since, he despised himself still more profoundly. If she had asked for a woman in the house, it was far less for her own defence than for his humiliation. She needed no one to defend her. His humbled pride was her surest protection. He had never spoken a word of excuse or extenuation. The incident was as if it had never been. Yet its consequences were latent in every word that he and she exchanged, in every glance they instinctively turned from each other. Nothing now would ever shake her rule in the Red House. On the night of her meeting with Miss Hatchard's cousin, Charity lay in bed, her bare arms clasped under her rough head, and continued to think of him. She supposed that he meant to spend some time in North Dormer. He had said he was looking up the old houses in the neighbourhood, and though she was not very clear as to his purpose, or as to why anyone should look for old houses, when they lay in wait for one on every roadside, she understood that he needed the help of books, and resolved to hunt up the next day the volume she had failed to find, and any others that seemed related to the subject. Never had her ignorance of life and literature so weighed on her as in reliving the short scene of her discomfiture. "It's no use trying to be anything in this place," she muttered to her pillow, and she shrivelled at the vision of vague metropolises, shining super-Nettletons, where girls in better clothes than Belle Balch's talked fluently of architecture to young men with hands like Lucius Harney's. Then she remembered his sudden pause when he had come close to the desk and had his first look at her. The sight had made him forget what he was going to say. She recalled the change in his face, and jumping up, she ran over the bare boards to her washstand, found the matches, lit a candle, and lifted it to the square of looking-glass on the whitewashed wall. Her small face, usually so darkly pale, glowed like a rose in the faint orb of light, and under her rumpled hair her eyes seemed deeper and larger than by day. Perhaps, after all, it was a mistake to wish they were blue. A clumsy band and button fastened her unbleached nightgown about the throat. She undid it, freed her thin shoulders, and saw herself a bride in low-necked satin, walking down an aisle with Lucius Harney. He would kiss her as they left the church. She put down the candle and covered her face with her hands, as if to imprison the kiss. At that moment she heard Mr. Royal's step as he came up the stairs to bed, and a fierce revulsion of feeling swept over her. Until then she had merely despised him. Now deep hatred of him filled her heart. He became to her a horrible old man. The next day, when Mr. Royal came back to dinner, they faced each other in silence as usual. Verena's presence at the table was an excuse for their not talking, though her deafness would have permitted the freest interchange of confidences. But when the meal was over, and Mr. Royal rose from the table, he looked back at Charity, who had stayed to help the old woman clear the dishes. "I want to speak to you a minute," he said, and she followed him across the passage, wondering. He seated himself in his black horsehair armchair, and she leaned against the window indifferently. She was impatient to be gone to the library, to hunt for the book on North Dormer. "See here," he said, "why ain't you at the library the days you're supposed to be there?" The question, breaking in on her mood of blissful abstraction, deprived her of speech, and she stared at him for a moment without answering. "Who says I ain't?" "There's been some complaints made, it appears. Miss Hatchard sent for me this morning." Charity's smouldering resentment broke into a blaze. "I know. Orma Fry, and that toad of a Target girl, and Ben Fry, like as not. He's going round with her. The low-down sneaks. I always knew they'd try to have me out. As if anybody ever came to the library, anyhow." "Somebody did yesterday, and you weren't there." "Yesterday?" She laughed at her happy recollection. "At what time wasn't I there yesterday, I'd like to know?" "Round about 4 o'clock." Charity was silent. She had been so steeped in the dreamy remembrance of young Harney's visit that she had forgotten having deserted her post as soon as he had left the library. "Who came at 4 o'clock?" "Miss Hatchard did." "Miss Hatchard? Why, she ain't ever been near the place since she's been lame. She couldn't get up the steps if she tried." "She can be helped up, I guess. She was yesterday, anyhow, by the young fellow that's staying with her. He found you there, I understand, earlier in the afternoon, and he went back and told Miss Hatchard the books were in bad shape and needed attending to. She got excited and had herself wheeled straight round, and when she got there the place was locked, so she sent for me and told me about that, and about the other complaints. She claims you've neglected things, and that she's going to get a trained librarian." Charity had not moved while he spoke. She stood with her head thrown back against the window-frame, her arms hanging against her sides, and her hands so tightly clenched that she felt, without knowing what hurt her, the sharp edge of her nails against her palms. Of all Mr. Royal had said, she had retained only the phrase, "He told Miss Hatchard the books were in bad shape." What did she care for the other charges against her? Malice or truth, she despised them as she despised her detractors. But that the stranger to whom she had felt herself so mysteriously drawn should have betrayed her, that at the very moment when she had fled up the hillside to think of him more deliciously, he should have been hastening home to denounce her shortcomings. She remembered how, in the darkness of her room, she had covered her face to press his imagined kiss closer, and her heart raged against him for the liberty he had not taken. "Well, I'll go," she said suddenly. "I'll go right off." "Go where?" She heard the startled note in Mr. Royal's voice. "Why, out of their old library, straight out, and never set foot in it again. They needn't think I'm going to wait round and let them say they've discharged me." Charity Royal, you listen," he began, getting heavily out of his chair, but she waved him aside and walked out of the room. Upstairs she took the library key from the place where she always hid it under her pincushion. Who said she wasn't careful? Put on her hat and swept down again and out into the street. If Mr. Royal heard her go, he made no motion to detain her. His sudden rages probably made him understand the uselessness of reasoning with hers. She reached the brick temple, unlocked the door, and entered into the glacial twilight. "I'm glad I'll never have to sit in this old vault again when other folks are out in the sun," she said aloud, as the familiar chill took her. She looked with abhorrence at the long, dingy rows of books, the sheep-nosed Minerva on her black pedestal, and the mild-faced young man in a high stock whose effigy pined above her desk. She meant to take out of her drawer her roll of lace and the library register, and go straight to Miss Hatchard to announce her resignation. But suddenly a great desolation overcame her, and she sat down and laid her face against the desk. Her heart was ravaged by life's cruelest discovery. The first creature who had come toward her out of the wilderness had brought her anguish instead of joy. She did not cry. Tears came hard to her, and the storms of her heart spent themselves inwardly. But as she sat there in her dumb woe, she felt her life to be too desolate, too ugly and intolerable. "What have I ever done to it, that it should hurt me so?" she groaned, and pressed her fists against her lids, which were beginning to swell with weeping. I won't go there looking like a horror," she muttered, springing up and pushing back her hair as if it stifled her. She opened the drawer, dragged out the register, and turned toward the door. As she did so, it opened, and the young man from Miss Hatchard's came in, whistling. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Summer. He stopped and lifted his hat with a shy smile. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I thought there was no one here." Charity stood before him, barring his way. "You can't come in. The library ain't open to the public Wednesdays." "I know it's not, but my cousin gave me her key." "Miss Hatchard's got no right to give her key to other folks, any more'n I have. I'm the librarian, and I know the by-laws. This is my library." The young man looked profoundly surprised. "Why, I know it is. I'm so sorry if you mind my coming." "I suppose you came to see what more you could say to set her against me. But you needn't trouble. It's my library to-day, but it won't be this time to-morrow. I'm on the way now to take her back the key and the register." Young Harney's face grew grave, but without betraying the consciousness of guilt she had looked for. "I don't understand," he said. "There must be some mistake. Why should I say things against you to Miss Hatchard, or to any one?" The apparent evasiveness of the reply caused Charity's indignation to overflow. "I don't know why you should. I can understand Orma Fry's doing it, because she's always wanted to get me out of here ever since the first day. I can't see why, when she's got her own home, and her father to work for her. Nor Ida Targett neither, when she got a legacy from her step-brother only last year. But anyway, we all live in the same place, and when it's a place like North Dormer, it's enough to make people hate each other just to have to walk down the same street every day. But you don't live here, and you don't know anything about any of us, so what did you have to meddle for? Do you suppose the other girls had kept the books any better than I did? Why, Orma Fry don't hardly know a book from a flat-iron. And what if I don't always sit round here doing nothing till it strikes 5 up at the church? Who cares if the library's open or shut? Do you suppose anybody ever comes here for books? What they'd like to come for is to meet the fellows they're going with if I'd let 'em. But I wouldn't let Bill Solus from over the hill hang round here waiting for the youngest Target girl, because I know him, that's all, even if I don't know about books all I ought to." She stopped with a choking in her throat. Tremors of rage were running through her, and she steadied herself against the edge of the desk, lest he should see her weakness. What he saw seemed to affect him deeply, for he grew red under his sunburn, and stammered out, "But, Miss Royal, I assure you—" His distress inflamed her anger, and she regained her voice to fling back, "If I was you, I'd have the nerve to stick to what I said." The taunt seemed to restore his presence of mind. "I hope I should, if I knew, but I don't. Apparently something disagreeable has happened, for which you think I'm to blame, but I don't know what it is, because I've been up on Eagle Ridge ever since the early morning. I don't know where you've been this morning, but I know you were here in this library yesterday, and it was you that went home and told your cousin the books were in bad shape, and brought her round to see how I'd neglected them." Young Harney looked sincerely concerned. "Was that what you were told? I don't wonder you're angry. The books are in bad shape, and as some are interesting, it's a pity. I told Miss Hatchard they were suffering from dampness and lack of air, and I brought her here to show her how easily the place could be ventilated. I also told her you ought to have some one to help you to do the dusting and airing. If you were given a wrong version of what I said, I'm sorry, but I'm so fond of old books that I'd rather see them made into a bonfire than left to moulder away like these." Charity felt her sobs rising, and tried to stifle them in words. "I don't care what you say you told her. All I know is she thinks it's all my fault, and I'm going to lose my job,
And I wanted it more'n anyone else in the village, because I haven't got anybody belonging to me, the way other folks have. All I wanted was to put aside money enough to get away from here some time. Do you suppose if it hadn't been for that I'd have kept on sitting day after day in this old vault?" Of this appeal her hearer took up only the last question. "It is an old vault, but need it be? That's the point, and it's my putting the question to my cousin that seems to have been the cause of the trouble." His glance explored the melancholy penumbra of the long narrow room, resting on the blotched walls, the discoloured rows of books, and the stern rosewood desk surmounted by the portrait of the young Honorius. "Of course it's a bad job to do anything with a building jammed against a hill like this ridiculous mausoleum. You couldn't get a good draught through it without blowing a hole in the mountain. But it can be ventilated after a fashion, and the sun can be let in. I'll show you if you like." The architect's passion for improvement had already made him lose sight of her grievance, and he lifted his stick instructively toward the cornice. But her silence seemed to tell him that she took no interest in the ventilation of the library, and turning back to her abruptly, he held out both hands. "Look here, you don't mean what you said. You don't really think I'd do anything to hurt you?" A new note in his voice disarmed her. No one had ever spoken to her in that tone. "Oh, what did you do it for, then?" she wailed. He had her hands in his, and she was feeling the smooth touch that she had imagined the day before on the hillside. He pressed her hands lightly and let them go. "Why, to make things pleasanter for you here, and better for the books. I'm sorry if my cousin twisted around what I said. She's excitable, and lives on trifles. I ought to have remembered that. Don't punish me by letting her think you take her seriously." It was wonderful to hear him speak of Miss Hatchard as if she were a querulous baby. In spite of his shyness, he had the air of power that the experience of cities probably gave. It was the fact of having lived in Nettleton that made Lawyer Royal, in spite of his infirmities, the strongest man in North Dormer, and Charity was sure that this young man had lived in bigger places than Nettleton. She felt that if she kept up her denunciatory tone, he would secretly class her with Miss Hatchard, and the thought made her suddenly simple. "It don't matter to Miss Hatchard how I take her. Mr. Royal says she's going to get a trained librarian, and I'd sooner resign than have the village say she sent me away." "Naturally you would. But I'm sure she doesn't mean to send you away. At any rate, won't you give me the chance to find out first and let you know? It will be time enough to resign, if I'm mistaken." Her pride flamed into her cheeks at the suggestion of his intervening. "I don't want anybody should coax her to keep me if I don't suit." He coloured too. "I give you my word I won't do that. Only wait till tomorrow, will you?" He looked straight into her eyes with his shy grey glance. "You can trust me, you know. You really can." All the old frozen woes seemed to melt in her, and she murmured awkwardly, looking away from him, "Oh, I'll wait." End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Summer. There had never been such a June in Eagle County. Usually it was a month of moods, with abrupt alternations of belated frost and midsummer heat. This year, day followed day in a sequence of temperate beauty. Every morning a breeze blew steadily from the hills. Toward noon it built up great canopies of white cloud that threw a cool shadow over fields and woods. Then before sunset the clouds dissolved again, and the western light rained its unobstructed brightness on the valley. On such an afternoon Charity Royal lay on a ridge above a sunlit hollow, her face pressed to the earth, and the warm currents of the grass running through her. Directly in her line of vision a blackberry branch laid its frail white flowers and blue-green leaves against the sky. Just beyond, a tuft of sweet-fern uncurled beneath the beaded shoots of the grass, and a small yellow butterfly vibrated over them like a fleck of sunshine. This was all she saw, but she felt, above her and about her, the strong growth of the beeches clothing the ridge, the rounding of pale green cones on countless spruce branches, the push of myriads of sweet-fern fronds in the cracks of the stony slope below the wood, and the crowding shoots of meadow-sweet and yellow flags in the pasture beyond. All this bubbling of sap and slipping of sheaths and bursting of calyxes was carried to her on mingled currents of fragrance. Every leaf and bud and blade seemed to contribute its exhalation to the pervading sweetness in which the pungency of pine-sap prevailed over the spice of thyme and the subtle perfume of fern, and all were merged in a moist earth-smell that was like the breath of some huge sun-warmed animal. Charity had lain there a long time, passive and sun-warmed as the slope on which she lay, when there came between her eyes and the dancing butterfly the sight of a man's foot in a large worn boot, covered with red mud. "Oh, don't!" she exclaimed, raising herself on her elbow and stretching out a warning hand. "Don't what?" a hoarse voice asked above her head. "Don't stamp on those bramble-flowers, you dolt!" she retorted, springing to her knees. The foot paused and then descended clumsily on the frail branch, and raising her eyes, she saw above her the bewildered face of a slouching man with a thin sunburnt beard, and white arms showing through his ragged shirt. "Don't you ever see anything, Liff Hyatt?" she assailed him, as he stood before her with the look of a man who has stirred up a wasp's nest. He grinned. "I seen you. That's what I come down for." "Down from where?" she questioned, stooping to gather up the petals his foot had scattered. He jerked his thumb toward the heights. "Been cutting down trees for Dan Target." Charity sank back on her heels and looked at him musingly. She was not in the least afraid of poor Liff Hyatt, though he came from the mountain, and some of the girls ran when they saw him. Among the more reasonable he passed for a harmless creature, a sort of link between the mountain and civilized folk, who occasionally came down and did a little wood-cutting for a farmer when hands were short. Besides, she knew the mountain people would never hurt her. Liff himself had told her so once when she was a little girl, and had met him one day at the edge of Lawyer Royal's pasture. "They won't any of 'em touch you up there, if you ever was to come up. But I don't suppose you will," he had added philosophically, looking at her new shoes, and at the red ribbon that Mrs. Royal had tied in her hair. Charity had, in truth, never felt any desire to visit her birthplace. She did not care to have it known that she was of the mountain, and was shy of being seen in talk with Liff Hyatt. But to-day she was not sorry to have him appear. A great many things had happened to her since the day when young Lucius Harney had entered the doors of the Hatchet Memorial, but none perhaps so unforeseen as the fact of her suddenly finding it a convenience to be on good terms with Liff Hyatt. She continued to look up curiously at his freckled, weather-beaten face, with feverish hollows below the cheek-bones, and the pale yellow eyes of a harmless animal. "I wonder if he's related to me," she thought, with a shiver of disdain. "Is there any folks living in the brown house by the swamp, up under Porcupine?" she presently asked in an indifferent tone. Liff Hyatt for a while considered her with surprise. Then he scratched his head and shifted his weight from one tattered sole to the other. "There's always the same folks in the brown house," he said with his vague grin. "They're from up your way, ain't they?" "Their name's the same as mine," he rejoined uncertainly. Charity still held him with resolute eyes. "See here, I want to go there some day and take a gentleman with me that's boarding with us. He's up in these parts drawing pictures." She did not offer to explain this statement. It was too far beyond Liff Hyatt's limitations for the attempt to be worth making. "He wants to see the brown house, and go all over it," she pursued. Liff was still running his fingers perplexedly through his shock of straw-coloured hair. "Is it a fellow from the city?" he asked. "Yes, he draws pictures of things. He's down there now, drawing the Bonner house." She pointed to a chimney just visible over the dip of the pasture below the wood. "The Bonner house?" Liff echoed incredulously. "Yes. You won't understand, and it don't matter. All I say is, he's going to the Hyatts in a day or two." Liff looked more and more perplexed. "Bash is ugly sometimes in the afternoons." She threw her head back, her eyes full on Hyatt's. I'm coming too. You tell him." "They won't none of 'em trouble you, the Hyatts won't. What do you want to take a stranger with you, though?" "I've told you, haven't I? You've got to tell Bash Hyatt." He looked away at the blue mountains on the horizon, then his gaze dropped to the chimney-top below the pasture. "He's down there now?" "Yes." He shifted his weight again, crossed his arms, and continued to survey the distant landscape. "Well, so long," he said at last, inconclusively, and turning away he shambled up the hillside. From the ledge above her he paused to call down, "I wouldn't go there a Sunday." Then he clambered on till the trees closed in on him. Presently, from high overhead, Charity heard the ring of his axe. She lay on the warm ridge, thinking of many things that the woodsman's appearance had stirred up in her. She knew nothing of her early life, and had never felt any curiosity about it, only a sullen reluctance to explore the corner of her memory where certain blurred images lingered. But all that had happened to her within the last few weeks had stirred her to the sleeping depths. She had become absorbingly interesting to herself, and everything that had to do with her past was illuminated by this sudden curiosity. She hated more than ever the fact of coming from the mountain, but it was no longer indifferent to her. Everything that in any way affected her was alive and vivid. Even the hateful things had grown interesting, because they were a part of herself. "I wonder if Liff Hyatt knows who my mother was," she mused, and it filled her with a tremor of surprise to think that some woman who was once young and slight, with quick motions of the blood like hers, had carried her in her breast and watched her sleeping. She had always thought of her mother as so long dead as to be no more than a nameless pinch of earth, but now it occurred to her that the once young woman might be alive, and wrinkled and elf-locked like the woman she had sometimes seen in the door of the brown house that Lucius Harney wanted to draw. The thought brought him back to the central point in her mind, and she strayed away from the conjectures roused by Liff Hyatt's presence. Speculations concerning the past could not hold her long when the present was so rich, the future so rosy, and when Lucius Harney, a stone's throw away, was bending over his sketch-book, frowning, calculating, measuring, and then throwing his head back with a sudden smile that had shed its brightness over everything. She scrambled to her feet, but as she did so, she saw him coming up the pasture, and dropped down on the grass to wait. When he was drawing and measuring one of his houses, as she called them, she often strayed away by herself into the woods or up the hillside. It was partly from shyness that she did so, from a sense of inadequacy that came to her most painfully when her companion, absorbed in his job, forgot her ignorance and her inability to follow his least allusion, and plunged into a monologue on art and life. To avoid the awkwardness of listening with a blank face, and also to escape the surprised stare of the inhabitants of the houses before which he would abruptly pull up their horse and open his sketch-book, she slipped away to some spot from which, without being seen, she could watch him at work, or at least look down on the house he was drawing. She had not been displeased at first to have it known to North Dormer and the neighbourhood that she was driving Miss Hatchard's cousin about the country in the buggy he had hired of Lawyer Royal. She had always kept to herself, contemptuously aloof from village love-making, without exactly knowing whether her fierce pride was due to the sense of her tainted origin, or whether she was reserving herself for a more brilliant fate. Sometimes she envied the other girls their sentimental preoccupations, their long hours of inarticulate philandering with one of the few youths who still lingered in the village, but when she pictured herself curling her hair or putting a new ribbon on her hat for Ben Fry or one of the Solace boys, the fever dropped and she relapsed into indifference. Now she knew the meaning of her disdains and reluctances. She had learned what she was worth when Lucius Harney, looking at her for the first time, had lost the thread of his speech, and leaned reddening on the edge of her desk. But another kind of shyness had been born in her, a terror of exposing to vulgar perils the sacred treasure of her happiness. She was not sorry to have the neighbours suspect her of going with a young man from the city, but she did not want it known to all the countryside how many hours of the long June days she spent with him. What she most feared was that the inevitable comment should reach Mr. Royal. Charity was instinctively aware that few things concerning her escaped the eyes of the silent man under whose roof she lived, and in spite of the latitude which North Dormer accorded to courting couples, she had always felt that, on the day when she showed too open a preference, Mr. Royal might, as she phrased it, make her pay for it. How, she did not know, and her fear was the greater because it was undefinable. If she had been accepting the attentions of one of the village youths, she would have been less apprehensive. Mr. Royal could not prevent her marrying when she chose to. But everybody knew that going with a city fellow was a different and less straightforward affair. Almost every village could show a victim of the perilous venture, and her dread of Mr. Royal's intervention gave a sharpened joy to the hours she spent with young Harney, and made her at the same time shy of being too generally seen with him. As he approached, she rose to her knees, stretching her arms above her head with the indolent gesture that was her way of expressing a profound well-being. "I'm going to take you to that house up under Porcupine," she announced. "What house?" "Oh, yes, that ramshackle place near the swamp, with the gypsy-looking people hanging about. It's curious that a house with traces of real architecture should have been built in such a place. But the people were a sulky-looking lot. Do you suppose they'll let us in?" "They'll do whatever I tell them," she said with assurance. He threw himself down beside her. "Will they?" he rejoined with a smile. "Well, I should like to see what's left inside the house. And I should like to have a talk with the people. Who was it who was telling me the other day that they had come down from the mountain?" Charity shot a sideward look at him. It was the first time he had spoken of the mountain, except as a feature of the landscape. What else did he know about it, and about her relation to it? Her heart began to beat with the fierce impulse of resistance which she instinctively opposed to every imagined slight. "The mountain? I ain't afraid of the mountain." Her tone of defiance seemed to escape him. He lay breast down on the grass, breaking off sprigs of thyme and pressing them against his lips. Far off, above the folds of the nearer hills, the mountain thrust itself up menacingly against a yellow sunset. "I must go up there some day. I want to see it," he continued. Her heart-beats slackened, and she turned again to examine his profile. It was innocent of all unfriendly intention. "What do you want to go up the mountain for?" "Why, it must be rather a curious place. There's a queer colony up there, you know. Sort of outlaws, a little independent kingdom. Of course you've heard them spoken of, but I'm told they have nothing to do with the people in the valleys. Rather look down on them, in fact. I suppose they're rough customers, but they must have a good deal of character." She did not quite know what he meant by having a good deal of character, but his tone was expressive of admiration, and deepened her dawning curiosity. It struck her now as strange that she knew so little about the mountain. She had never asked, and no one had ever offered to enlighten her. North Dormer took the mountain for granted, and implied its disparagement by an intonation rather than by explicit criticism. "It's queer, you know," he continued, "that just over there, on top of that hill, there should be a handful of people who don't give a damn for anybody." The words thrilled her. They seemed the clue to her own revolts and defiances, and she longed to have him tell her more. "I don't know much about them. Have they always been there?" "Nobody seems to know exactly how long. Down at Creston they told me that the first colonists are supposed to have been men who worked on the railway that was built 40 or 50 years ago between Springfield and Nettleton. Some of the men took to drink, or got into trouble with the police, and went off, disappeared into the woods. A year or two later there was a report that they were living up on the mountain. Then I suppose others joined them, and children were born. Now they say there are over 100 people up there. They seem to be quite outside the jurisdiction of the valleys. No school, no church, and no sheriff ever goes up to see what they're about. But don't people talk of them at North Dormer?" "I don't know. They say they're bad." He laughed. "Do they? We'll go and see, shall we?" She flushed at the suggestion, and turned her face to his. "You never heard, I suppose. I come from there. They brought me down when I was little."
"You?"
He raised himself on his elbow, looking at her with sudden interest.
"You're from the mountain? How curious! I suppose that's why you're so different."
Her happy blood bathed her to the forehead. He was praising her, and praising her because she came from the mountain. "Am I different?" she triumphed, with affected wonder.
"Oh, awfully."
He picked up her hand, and laid a kiss on the sunburnt knuckles. "Come," he said, "let's be off." He stood up and shook the grass from his loose grey clothes. "What a good day! Where are you going to take me tomorrow?"
Chapter 6 of Summer. That evening after supper, Charity sat alone in the kitchen and listened to Mr. Royal and young Harney talking on the porch. She had remained indoors after the table had been cleared and old Verena had hobbled up to bed. The kitchen window was open, and Charity seated herself near it, her idle hands on her knee. The evening was cool and still. Beyond the black hills an amber west passed into pale green, and then to a deep blue in which a great star hung. The soft hoot of a little owl came through the dusk, and between its calls the men's voices rose and fell. Mr. Royal's was full of a sonorous satisfaction. It was a long time since he had had anyone of Lucius Harney's quality to talk to. Charity divined that the young man symbolized all his ruined and unforgotten past. When Miss Hatchard had been called to Springfield by the illness of a widowed sister, and young Harney, by that time seriously embarked on his task of drawing and measuring all the old houses between Nettleton and the New Hampshire border, had suggested the possibility of boarding at the Red House in his cousin's absence, Charity had trembled lest Mr. Royal should refuse. There had been no question of lodging the young man, there was no room for him. But it appeared that he could still live at Miss Hatchard's, if Mr. Royal would let him take his meals at the Red House, and after a day's deliberation Mr. Royal consented. Charity suspected him of being glad of the chance to make a little money. He had the reputation of being an avaricious man, but she was beginning to think he was probably poorer than people knew. His practice had become little more than a vague legend, revived only at lengthening intervals by a summons to Hepburn or Nettleton, and he appeared to depend for his living mainly on the scant produce of his farm, and on the commissions received from the few insurance agencies that he represented in the neighbourhood. At any rate, he had been prompt in accepting Harney's offer to hire the buggy at $1.50 a day, and his satisfaction with the bargain had manifested itself, unexpectedly enough, at the end of the first week, by his tossing a $10 bill into Charity's lap as she sat one day re-trimming her old hat. "Here, go get yourself a Sunday bonnet that'll make all the other girls mad," he said, looking at her with a sheepish twinkle in his deep-set eyes, and she immediately guessed that the unwonted present, the only gift of money she had ever received from him, represented Harney's first payment. But the young man's coming had brought Mr. Royal other than pecuniary benefit. It gave him, for the first time in years, a man's companionship. Charity had only a dim understanding of her guardian's needs, but she knew he felt himself above the people among whom he lived, and she saw that Lucius Harney thought him so. She was surprised to find how well he seemed to talk, now that he had a listener who understood him, and she was equally struck by young Harney's friendly deference. Their conversation was mostly about politics, and beyond her range, but tonight it had a peculiar interest for her, for they had begun to speak of the mountain. She drew back a little, lest they should see she was in hearing. "The mountain? The mountain?" she heard Mr. Royal say. "Why, the mountain's a blot. That's what it is, sir, a blot. That scum up there ought to have been run in long ago, and would have if the people down here hadn't been clean scared of them. The mountain belongs to this township, and it's North Dormer's fault if there's a gang of thieves and outlaws living over there in sight of us, defying the laws of their country. Why, there ain't a sheriff or a tax collector or a coroner durst go up there.
When they hear of trouble on the mountain, the select-men look the other way, and pass an appropriation to beautify the town pump. The only man that ever goes up is the minister, and he goes because they send down and get him whenever there's any of them dies. They think a lot of Christian burial on the mountain, but I never heard of their having the minister up to marry them. And they never trouble the justice of the peace, either. They just herd together like the heathen."
He went on, explaining in somewhat technical language how the little colony of squatters had contrived to keep the law at bay, and Charity, with burning eagerness, awaited young Harney's comment. But the young man seemed more concerned to hear Mr. Royal's views than to express his own. "I suppose you've never been up there yourself?" he presently asked.
"Yes, I have," said Mr. Royal with a contemptuous laugh. "The wiseacres down here told me I'd be done for before I got back, but nobody lifted a finger to hurt me. And I just had one of their gang sent up for 7 years, too."
"You went up after that?"
"Yes, sir, right after it. The fellow came down to Nettleton and ran amuck, the way they sometimes do. After they've done a wood-cutting job, they come down and blow the money in, and this man ended up with manslaughter. I got him convicted, though they were scared of the mountain even at Nettleton. And then a queer thing happened. The fellow sent for me to go and see him in jail. I went, and this is what he says. 'The fool that defended me is a chicken-livered son of a—' and all the rest of it, he says. And I've got a job to be done for me up on the mountain, and you're the only man I seen in court that looks as if he'd do it. He told me he had a child up there, or thought he had, a little girl, and he wanted her brought down and reared like a Christian. I was sorry for the fellow, so I went up and got the child."
He paused, and Charity listened with a throbbing heart.
"That's the only time I ever went up the mountain," he concluded.
There was a moment's silence, and then Harney spoke. "And the child? Had she no mother?"
"Oh, yes, there was a mother, but she was glad enough to have her go. She'd have given her to anybody. They ain't half human up there. I guess the mother's dead by now, with the life she was leading. Anyhow, I've never heard of her from that day to this."
"My God, how ghastly!" Harney murmured, and Charity, choking with humiliation, sprang to her feet and ran upstairs. She knew at last, knew that she was the child of a drunken convict and of a mother who wasn't half human, and was glad to have her go. And she had heard this history of her origin related to the one being in whose eyes she longed to appear superior to the people about her. She had noticed that Mr. Royal had not named her, had even avoided any allusion that might identify her with the child he had brought down from the mountain, and she knew it was out of regard for her that he had kept silent. But of what use was his discretion, since only that afternoon, misled by Harney's interest in the outlaw colony, she had boasted to him of coming from the mountain? Now every word that had been spoken showed her how such an origin must widen the distance between them. During his 10 days' sojourn at North Dormer, Lucius Harney had not spoken a word of love to her. He had intervened in her behalf with his cousin, and had convinced Miss Hatchard of her merits as a librarian, but that was a simple act of justice, since it was by his own fault that those merits had been questioned. He had asked her to drive him about the country when he hired Lawyer Royal's buggy to go on his sketching expeditions, but that too was natural enough, since he was unfamiliar with the region. Lastly, when his cousin was called to Springfield, he had begged Mr. Royal to receive him as a boarder. But where else in North Dormer could he have boarded? Not with Carrick Fry, whose wife was paralyzed, and whose large family crowded his table to overflowing. Not with the Targets, who lived a mile up the road, nor with poor old Mrs. Hawes, who, since her eldest daughter had deserted her, barely had the strength to cook her own meals while Ally picked up her living as a seamstress. Mr. Royal's was the only house where the young man could have been offered a decent hospitality. There had been nothing, therefore, in the outward course of events to raise in Charity's breast the hopes with which it trembled. But beneath the visible incidents resulting from Lucius Harney's arrival, there ran an undercurrent as mysterious and potent as the influence that makes the forest break into leaf before the ice is off the pools. The business on which Harney had come was authentic.
Charity had seen the letter from a New York publisher commissioning him to make a study of the 18th-century houses in the less familiar districts of New England. But incomprehensible as the whole affair was to her, and hard as she found it to understand why he paused enchanted before certain neglected and paintless houses, while others, refurbished and improved by the local builder, did not arrest a glance, she could not but suspect that Eagle County was less rich in architecture than he averred, and that the duration of his stay, which he had fixed at a month, was not unconnected with the look in his eyes when he had first paused before her in the library. Everything that had followed seemed to have grown out of that look: his way of speaking to her, his quickness in catching her meaning, his evident eagerness to prolong their excursions and to seize on every chance of being with her. The signs of his liking were manifest enough, but it was hard to guess how much they meant, because his manner was so different from anything North Dormer had ever shown her. He was at once simpler and more deferential than any one she had known, and sometimes it was just when he was simplest that she most felt the distance between them. Education and opportunity had divided them by a width that no effort of hers could bridge, and even when his youth and his admiration brought him nearest, some chance word, some unconscious allusion, seemed to thrust her back across the gulf. Never had it yawned so wide as when she fled up to her room, carrying with her the echo of Mr. Royal's tale. Her first confused thought was the prayer that she might never see young Harney again. It was too bitter to picture him as the detached, impartial listener to such a story. "I wish he'd go away. I wish he'd go tomorrow and never come back," she moaned to her pillow, and far into the night she lay there, in the disordered dress she had forgotten to take off, her whole soul a tossing misery on which her hopes and dreams spun about like drowning straws. Of all this tumult, only a vague heart-soreness was left when she opened her eyes the next morning. Her first thought was of the weather, for Harney had asked her to take him to the brown house under Porcupine, and then around by Hamblin, and as the trip was a long one, they were to start at 9. The sun rose without a cloud, and earlier than usual she was in the kitchen, making cheese sandwiches, decanting buttermilk into a bottle, wrapping up slices of apple pie, and accusing Verena of having given away a basket she needed, which had always hung on a hook in the passage. When she came out into the porch, in her pink calico, which had run a little in the washing, but was still bright enough to set off her dark tints, she had such a triumphant sense of being a part of the sunlight and the morning that the last trace of her misery vanished. What did it matter where she came from, or whose child she was, when love was dancing in her veins, and down the road she saw young Harney coming toward her? Mr. Royal was on the porch too. He said nothing at breakfast, but when she came out in her pink dress, the basket in her hand, he looked at her with surprise. "Where you goin' to?" he asked. "Why, Mr. Harney's starting earlier than usual today," she answered. "Mr. Harney! Mr. Harney! Ain't Mr. Harney learned how to drive a horse yet?" She made no answer, and he sat tilted back in his chair, drumming on the rail of the porch. It was the first time he had ever spoken of the young man in that tone, and Charity felt a faint chill of apprehension. After a moment he stood up and walked away toward the bit of ground behind the house, where the hired man was hoeing. The air was cool and clear, with the autumnal sparkle that a north wind brings to the hills in early summer, and the night had been so still that the dew hung on everything, not as a lingering moisture, but in separate beads that glittered like diamonds on the ferns and grasses. It was a long drive to the foot of Porcupine, first across the valley, with blue hills bounding the open slopes, then down into the beech woods, following the course of the Creston, a brown brook leaping over velvet ledges, then out again onto the farmlands about Creston Lake, and gradually up the ridges of the Eagle Range. At last they reached the yoke of the hills, and before them opened another valley, green and wild, and beyond it more blue heights eddying away to the sky like the waves of a receding tide. Harney tied the horse to a tree stump,
and they unpacked their basket under an aged walnut with a riven trunk out of which bumblebees darted. The sun had grown hot, and behind them was the noonday murmur of the forest. Summer insects danced on the air, and a flock of white butterflies fanned the mobile tips of the crimson fireweed. In the valley below not a house was visible. It seemed as if Charity Royal and young Harney were the only living beings in the great hollow of earth and sky. Charity's spirits flagged, and disquieting thoughts stole back on her. Young Harney had grown silent, and as he lay beside her, his arms under his head, his eyes on the network of leaves above him, she wondered if he were musing on what Mr. Royal had told him, and if it had really debased her in his thoughts. She wished he had not asked her to take him that day to the brown house. She did not want him to see the people she came from, while the story of her birth was fresh in his mind. More than once she had been on the point of suggesting that they should follow the ridge and drive straight to Hamblin, where there was a little deserted house he wanted to see, but shyness and pride held her back. "He'd better know what kind of folks I belong to," she said to herself, with a somewhat forced defiance, for in reality it was shame that kept her silent. Suddenly she lifted her hand and pointed to the sky. "There's a storm coming up." He followed her glance and smiled. "Is it that scrap of cloud among the pines that frightens you?" "It's over the mountain, and a cloud over the mountain always means trouble." "Oh, I don't believe half the bad things you all say of the mountain. But anyhow we'll get down to the brown house before the rain comes." He was not far wrong, for only a few isolated drops had fallen when they turned into the road under the shaggy flank of Porcupine and came upon the brown house. It stood alone beside a swamp bordered with alder thickets and tall bulrushes. Not another dwelling was in sight, and it was hard to guess what motive could have actuated the early settler who had made his home in so unfriendly a spot. Charity had picked up enough of her companion's erudition to understand what had attracted him to the house. She noticed the fan-shaped tracery of the broken light above the door, the fluting of the paintless pilasters at the corners, and the round window set in the gable, and she knew, for reasons that still escaped her, these were things to be admired and recorded. Still, they had seen other houses far more typical, the word was Harney's, and as he threw the reins on the horse's neck, he said with a slight shiver of repugnance, "We won't stay long." Against the restless alders turning their white lining to the storm, the house looked singularly desolate. The paint was almost gone from the clapboards, the window panes were broken and patched with rags, and the garden was a poisonous tangle of nettles, burdocks, and tall swamp weeds, over which big bluebottles hummed. At the sound of wheels a child with a towhead and pale eyes like Liff Hyatt's peered over the fence and then slipped away behind an outhouse. Harney jumped down and helped Charity out, and as he did so the rain broke on them. It came slantwise on a furious gale, laying shrubs and young trees flat, tearing off their leaves like an autumn storm, turning the road into a river, and making hissing pools of every hollow. Thunder rolled incessantly through the roar of the rain, and a strange glitter of light ran along the ground under the increasing blackness. "Lucky we're here after all," Harney laughed. He fastened the horse under a half-roofless shed, and wrapping Charity in his coat, ran with her to the house. The boy had not reappeared, and as there was no response to their knocks, Harney turned the door-handle, and they went in. There were 3 people in the kitchen to which the door admitted them. An old woman with a handkerchief over her head was sitting by the window. She held a sickly-looking kitten on her knees, and whenever it jumped down and tried to limp away, she stooped and lifted it back without any change of her aged, unnoticing face. Another woman, the unkempt creature that Charity had once noticed in driving by, stood leaning against the window-frame and stared at them, and near the stove an unshaved man in a tattered shirt sat on a barrel asleep. The place was bare and miserable, and the air heavy with the smell of dirt and stale tobacco. Charity's heart sank. Old derided tales of the mountain people came back to her, and the woman's stare was so disconcerting, and the face of the sleeping man so sodden and bestial,
that her disgust was tinged with a vague dread. She was not afraid for herself. She knew the Hyetts would not be likely to trouble her, but she was not sure how they would treat a city fellow. Lucius Harney would certainly have laughed at her fears. He glanced about the room, uttered a general "How are you?" to which no one responded, and then asked the younger woman if they might take shelter till the storm was over. She turned her eyes away from him and looked at Charity. "You're the girl from Royals, ain't you?" The colour rose in Charity's face. "I'm Charity Royal," she said, as if asserting her right to the name in the very place where it might have been most open to question. The woman did not seem to notice. "You can stay," she merely said. Then she turned away and stooped over a dish in which she was stirring something. Harney and Charity sat down on a bench made of a board resting on two starch boxes. They faced a door hanging on a broken hinge, and through the crack they saw the eyes of the tow-headed boy and of a pale little girl with a scar across her cheek. Charity smiled and signed to the children to come in, but as soon as they saw they were discovered, they slipped away on bare feet. It occurred to her that they were afraid of rousing the sleeping man, and probably the woman shared their fear, for she moved about as noiselessly and avoided going near the stove. The rain continued to beat against the house, and in one or two places it sent a stream through the patched panes and ran into pools on the floor. Every now and then the kitten mewed and struggled down, and the old woman stooped and caught it, holding it tight in her bony hands, and once or twice the man on the barrel half woke, changed his position, and dozed again, his head falling forward on his hairy breast. As the minutes passed, and the rain still streamed against the windows, a loathing of the place and the people came over Charity. The sight of the weak-minded old woman, of the cowed children, and the ragged man sleeping off his liquor, made the setting of her own life seem a vision of peace and plenty. She thought of the kitchen at Mr. Royal's, with its scrubbed floor and dresser full of china, and the peculiar smell of yeast and coffee and soft soap that she had always hated, but that now seemed the very symbol of household order. She saw Mr. Royal's room, with the high-backed horsehair chair, the faded rag carpet, the row of books on a shelf, the engraving of the Surrender of Burgoyne over the stove, and the mat with a brown and white spaniel on a moss-green border. And then her mind travelled to Miss Hatchard's house, where all was freshness, purity, and fragrance, and compared to which the Red House had always seemed so poor and plain. "This is where I belong. This is where I belong," she kept repeating to herself, but the words had no meaning for her. Every instinct and habit made her a stranger amongst these poor swamp people living like vermin in their lair. With all her soul she wished she had not yielded to Harney's curiosity and brought him there. The rain had drenched her, and she began to shiver under the thin folds of her dress. The younger woman must have noticed it, for she went out of the room and came back with a broken teacup, which she offered to Charity. It was half full of whiskey, and Charity shook her head, but Harney took the cup and put his lips to it. When he had set it down, Charity saw him feel in his pocket and draw out $1. He hesitated a moment and then put it back, and she guessed that he did not wish her to see him offering money to people she had spoken of as being her kin. The sleeping man stirred, lifted his head, and opened his eyes. They rested vacantly for a moment on Charity and Harney, and then closed again, and his head drooped. But a look of anxiety came into the woman's face. She glanced out of the window and then came up to Harney. "I guess you better go along now," she said. The young man understood and got to his feet. "Thank you," he said, holding out his hand. She seemed not to notice the gesture, and turned away as they opened the door. The rain was still coming down, but they hardly noticed it. The pure air was like balm in their faces. The clouds were rising and breaking, and between their edges the light streamed down from remote blue hollows. Harney untied the horse, and they drove off through the diminishing rain, which was already beaded with sunlight. For a while Charity was silent, and her companion did not speak. She looked timidly at his profile. It was graver than usual, as though he too were oppressed by what they had seen. Then she broke out abruptly, "Those people back there are the kind of folks I come from. They may be my relations for all I know." She did not want him to think that she regretted having told him her story. "Poor creatures," he rejoined. "I wonder why they came down to that fever-hole." She laughed ironically. "To better themselves. It's worse up on the mountain. Bash Hyatt married the daughter of the farmer that used to own the brown house. That was him by the stove, I suppose." Harney seemed to find nothing to say, and she went on. "I saw you take out $1 to give to that poor woman. Why did you put it back?" He reddened, and leaned forward to flick a swamp-fly from the horse's neck. "I wasn't sure." "Was it because you knew they were my folks, and thought I'd be ashamed to see you give them money?" He turned to her with eyes full of reproach. "Oh, Charity!" It was the first time he had ever called her by her name. Her misery welled over. I ain't ashamed. They're my people, and I ain't ashamed of them," she sobbed. "My dear," he murmured, putting his arm about her, and she leaned against him and wept out her pain. It was too late to go around to Hamblin, and all the stars were out in a clear sky when they reached the North Dormer Valley and drove up to the red house. Chapter 7 of Summer. Since her reinstatement in Miss Hatchard's favour, Charity had not dared to curtail by a moment her hours of attendance at the library. She even made a point of arriving before the time, and showed a laudable indignation when the youngest Target girl, who had been engaged to help in the cleaning and rearranging of the books, came trailing in late, and neglected her task to peer through the window at the soulless boy. Nevertheless, library days seemed more than ever irksome to Charity after her vivid hours of liberty, and she would have found it hard to set a good example to her subordinate if Lucius Harney had not been commissioned, before Miss Hatchard's departure, to examine with the local carpenter the best means of ventilating the memorial. He was careful to prosecute this inquiry on the days when the library was open to the public, and Charity was therefore sure of spending part of the afternoon in his company. The Target girl's presence, and the risk of being interrupted by some passer-by suddenly smitten with a thirst for letters, restricted their intercourse to the exchange of commonplaces, but there was a fascination to Charity in the contrast between these public civilities and their secret intimacy. The day after their drive to the brown house was library day, and she sat at her desk working at the revised catalogue, while the Target girl, one eye on the window, chanted out the titles of a pile of books. Charity's thoughts were far away, in the dismal house by the swamp, and under the twilight sky during the long drive home, when Lucius Harney had consoled her with endearing words. That day, for the first time since he had been boarding with them, he had failed to appear as usual at the midday meal. No message had come to explain his absence, and Mr. Royal, who was more than usually taciturn, had betrayed no surprise, and made no comment. In itself this indifference was not particularly significant, for Mr. Royal, in common with most of his fellow-citizens, had a way of accepting events passively, as if he had long since come to the conclusion that no one who lived in North Dormer could hope to modify them. But to Charity, in the reaction from her mood of passionate exultation, there was something disquieting in his silence. It was almost as if Lucius Harney had never had a part in their lives. Mr. Royal's imperturbable indifference seemed to relegate him to the domain of unreality. As she sat at work, she tried to shake off her disappointment at Harney's non-appearing. Some trifling incident had probably kept him from joining them at midday, but she was sure he must be eager to see her again, and that he would not want to wait till they met at supper, between Mr. Royal and Verena. She was wondering what his first words would be, and trying to devise a way of getting rid of the Target girl before he came, when she heard steps outside, and he walked up the path with Mr. Miles. The clergyman from Hepburn seldom came to North Dormer, except when he drove over to officiate at the old white church, which, by an unusual chance, happened to belong to the Episcopal communion. He was a brisk, affable man, eager to make the most of the fact that a little nucleus of church people had survived in the sectarian wilderness, and resolved to undermine the influence of the gingerbread-coloured Baptist chapel at the other end of the village. But he was kept busy by parochial work in Hepburn, where there were paper-mills and saloons, and it was not often that he could spare time for North Dormer. Charity, who went to the White Church, like all the best people in North Dormer, admired Mr. Miles, and had even, during the memorable trip to Nettleton, imagined herself married to a man who had such a straight nose and such a beautiful way of speaking, and who lived in a brown-stone rectory covered with Virginia creeper. It had been a shock to discover that the privilege was already enjoyed by a lady with crimped hair and a large baby. But the arrival of Lucius Harney had long since banished Mr. Miles from Charity's dreams, and as he walked up the path at Harney's side, she saw him as he really was, a fat, middle-aged man with a baldness showing under his clerical hat, and spectacles on his Grecian nose. She wondered what had called him to North Dormer on a week-day, and felt a little hurt that Harney should have brought him to the library. It presently appeared that his presence there was due to Miss Hatchard. He had been spending a few days at Springfield, to fill a friend's pulpit, and had been consulted by Miss Hatchard as to young Harney's plan for ventilating the memorial. To lay hands on the Hatchard ark was a grave matter, and Miss Hatchard, always full of scruples about her scruples, it was Harney's phrase, wished to have Mr. Miles's opinion before deciding. "I couldn't," Mr. Miles explained, "quite make out from your cousin what changes you wanted to make, and as the other trustees did not understand either, I thought I had better drive over and take a look. Though I'm sure," he added, turning his friendly spectacles on the young man, "that no one could be more competent, but of course this spot has its peculiar sanctity." "I hope a little fresh air won't desecrate it," Harney laughingly rejoined, and they walked to the other end of the library while he set forth his idea to the rector. Mr. Miles had greeted the two girls with his usual friendliness, but Charity saw that he was occupied with other things, and she presently became aware, by the scraps of conversation drifting over to her, that he was still under the charm of his visit to Springfield, which appeared to have been full of agreeable incidents. "Ah, the Coopersons! Yes, you know them, of course," she heard. "That's a fine old house, and Ned Cooperson has collected some really remarkable impressionist pictures." The names he cited were unknown to Charity. "Yes, yes, the Schaeffer quartet played at Lyric Hall on Saturday evening, and on Monday I had the privilege of hearing them again at the Towers. Beautifully done. Bach and Beethoven. A lawn party first. I saw Miss Balch several times by the way, looking extremely handsome." Charity dropped her pencil and forgot to listen to the Target girl's sing-song. Why had Mr. Miles suddenly brought up Annabel Balch's name? "Oh, really?" she heard Harney rejoin, and raising his stick, he pursued, "You see, my plan is to move these shelves away and open a round window in this wall, on the axis of the one under the pediment." "I suppose she'll be coming up here later to stay with Miss Hatchard?" Mr. Miles went on, following on the train of thought, then spinning about and tilting his head back. "Yes, yes, I see, I understand. That will give a draught without materially altering the look of things. I can see no objection." The discussion went on for some minutes, and gradually the two men moved back toward the desk. Mr. Miles stopped again and looked thoughtfully at Charity. "Aren't you a little pale, my dear? Not overworking? Mr. Harney tells me you and Mamie are giving the library a thorough overhauling." He was always careful to remember his parishioners' Christian names, and at the right moment he bent his benignant spectacles on the Target girl. Then he turned to Charity. "Don't take things hard, my dear, don't take things hard. Come down and see Mrs. Miles and me some day at Hepburn," he said, pressing her hand and waving a farewell to Mamie Target. He went out of the library, and Harney followed him. Charity thought she detected a look of constraint in Harney's eyes. She fancied he did not want to be alone with her, and with a sudden pang she wondered if he repented the tender things he had said to her the night before. His words had been more fraternal than lover-like, but she had lost their exact sense in the caressing warmth of his voice. He had made her feel that the fact of her being a waif from the mountain was only another reason for holding her close and soothing her with consolatory murmurs, and when the drive was over, and she got out of the buggy, tired, cold, and aching with emotion,
She stepped as if the ground were a sunlit wave and she the spray on its crest. Why then had his manner suddenly changed, and why did he leave the library with Mr. Miles? Her restless imagination fastened on the name of Annabel Balch. From the moment it had been mentioned, she fancied that Harney's expression had altered. Annabel Balch at a garden party at Springfield, looking extremely handsome. Perhaps Mr. Miles had seen her there at the very moment when Charity and Harney were sitting in the Hyatts' hovel between a drunkard and a half-witted old woman. Charity did not know exactly what a garden party was, but her glimpse of the flower-edged lawns of Nettleton helped her to visualize the scene, and envious recollections of the old things which Miss Balch avowedly wore out when she came to North Dormer made it only too easy to picture her in her splendour. Charity understood what associations the name must have called up, and felt the uselessness of struggling against the unseen influences in Harney's life. When she came down from her room for supper, he was not there, and while she waited on the porch, she recalled the tone in which Mr. Royal had commented the day before on their early start. Mr. Royal sat at her side, his chair tilted back, his broad black boots with side elastics resting against the lower bars of the railings. His rumpled grey hair stood up above his forehead like the crest of an angry bird, and the leather brown of his veined cheeks was blotched with red. Charity knew that these red spots were the signs of a coming explosion. Suddenly he said, "Where's supper? Has Verena Marsh slipped up again on her soda biscuits?" Charity threw a startled glance at him. "I presume she's waiting for Mr. Harney." "Mr. Harney, is she? She'd better dish up, then. He ain't coming." He stood up, walked to the door, and called out, in the pitch necessary to penetrate the old woman's tympanum, "Get along with the supper, Verena." Charity was trembling with apprehension. Something had happened, she was sure of it now, and Mr. Royal knew what it was. But not for the world would she have gratified him by showing her anxiety. She took her usual place, and he seated himself opposite, and poured out a strong cup of tea before passing her the teapot. Verena brought some scrambled eggs, and he piled his plate with them. "Ain't you going to take any?" he asked. Charity roused herself and began to eat. The tone with which Mr. Royal had said, "He's not coming," seemed to her full of an ominous satisfaction. She saw that he had suddenly begun to hate Lucius Harney, and guessed herself to be the cause of this change of feeling. But she had no means of finding out whether some act of hostility on his part had made the young man stay away, or whether he simply wished to avoid seeing her again after their drive back from the brown house. She ate her supper with a studied show of indifference, but she knew that Mr. Royal was watching her, and that her agitation did not escape him. After supper she went up to her room. She heard Mr. Royal cross the passage, and presently the sounds below her window showed that he had returned to the porch. She seated herself on her bed, and began to struggle against the desire to go down and ask him what had happened. "I'd rather die than to do it," she muttered to herself. With a word he could have relieved her uncertainty, but never would she gratify him by saying it. She rose and leaned out of the window. The twilight had deepened into night, and she watched the frail curve of the young moon dropping to the edge of the hills. Through the darkness she saw one or two figures moving down the road, but the evening was too cold for loitering, and presently the strollers disappeared. Lamps were beginning to show here and there in the windows. A bar of light brought out the whiteness of a clump of lilies on the Hawes' yard, and farther down the street Carrick Fry's Rochester lamp cast its bold illumination on the rustic flower-tub in the middle of his grass-plot. For a long time she continued to lean in the window, but a fever of unrest consumed her, and finally she went downstairs, took her hat from its hook, and swung out of the house. Mr. Royal sat on the porch, Verena beside him, her old hands crossed on her patched skirt. As Charity went down the steps, Mr. Royal called after her, "Where are you going?" She could easily have answered, "To Orma's," or "Down to the Targetts'," and either answer might have been true, for she had no purpose. But she swept on in silence, determined not to recognize his right to question her. At the gate she paused and looked up and down the road. The darkness drew her, and she thought of climbing the hill and plunging into the depths of the larch-wood above the pasture. Then she glanced irresolutely along the street, and as she did so, a gleam appeared through the spruces at Miss Hatchard's gate. Lucius Harney was there, then. He had not gone down to Hepburn with Mr. Miles, as she had first imagined. But where had he taken his evening meal, and what had caused him to stay away from Mr. Royals? The light was positive proof of his presence, for Miss Hatchard's servants were away on a holiday, and her farmer's wife came only in the mornings, to make the young man's bed and prepare his coffee. Beside that lamp he was doubtless sitting at this moment. To know the truth, Charity had only to walk half the length of the village and knock at the lighted window. She hesitated a minute or two longer, and then turned toward Miss Hatchard's. She walked quickly, straining her eyes to detect anyone who might be coming along the street, and before reaching the Frys, she crossed over to avoid the light from their window. Whenever she was unhappy, she felt herself at bay against a pitiless world, and a kind of animal secretiveness possessed her. But the street was empty, and she passed unnoticed through the gate, and up the path to the house. Its white front glimmered indistinctly through the trees, showing only one oblong of light on the lower floor. She had supposed that the lamp was in Miss Hatchard's sitting-room, but she now saw that it shone through a window at the farther corner of the house. She did not know the room to which this window belonged, and she paused under the trees, checked by a sense of strangeness. Then she moved on, treading softly on the short grass, and keeping so close to the house that whoever was in the room, even if roused by her approach, would not be able to see her. The window opened on a narrow veranda with a trellised arch. She leaned close to the trellis, and parting the sprays of clematis that covered it, looked into a corner of the room. She saw the foot of a mahogany bed, an engraving on the wall, a washstand on which a towel had been tossed, and one end of the green-covered table which held the lamp. Half of the lampshade projected into her field of vision, and just under it two smooth sunburnt hands, one holding a pencil and the other a ruler, were moving to and fro over a drawing-board. Her heart jumped, and then stood still. He was there, a few feet away, and while her soul was tossing on seas of woe, he had been quietly sitting at his drawing-board. The sight of those two hands moving with their usual skill and precision woke her out of her dream. Her eyes were open to the disproportion between what she had felt and the cause of her agitation, and she was turning away from the window, when one hand abruptly pushed aside the drawing-board, and the other flung down the pencil. Charity had often noticed Harney's loving care of his drawings, and the neatness and method with which he carried on and concluded each task. The impatient sweeping aside of the drawing-board seemed to reveal a new mood. The gesture suggested sudden discouragement, or distaste for his work, and she wondered if he too were agitated by secret perplexities. Her impulse of flight was checked. She stepped up on the veranda, and looked into the room. Harney had put his elbows on the table, and was resting his chin on his locked hands. He had taken off his coat and waistcoat, and unbuttoned the low collar of his flannel shirt. She saw the vigorous lines of his young throat, and the root of the muscles where they joined the chest. He sat staring straight ahead of him, a look of weariness and self-disgust on his face. It was almost as if he had been gazing at a distorted reflection of his own features. For a moment Charity looked at him with a kind of terror, as if he had been a stranger under familiar lineaments. Then she glanced past him, and saw on the floor an open portmanteau half full of clothes. She understood that he was preparing to leave, and that he had probably decided to go without seeing her. She saw that the decision, from whatever cause it was taken, had disturbed him deeply, and she immediately concluded that his change of plan was due to some surreptitious interference of Mr. Royals. All her old resentments and rebellions flamed up, confusedly mingled with the yearning roused by Harney's nearness. Only a few hours earlier she had felt secure in his comprehending pity. Now she was flung back on herself, doubly alone after that moment of communion. Harney was still unaware of her presence. He sat without moving, moodily staring before him at the same spot in the wall-paper. He had not even had the energy to finish his packing, and his clothes and papers lay on the floor about the portmanteau. Presently he unlocked his clasped hands and stood up, and Charity, drawing back hastily, sank down on the step of the veranda. The night was so dark that there was not much chance of his seeing her unless he opened the window, and before that she would have time to slip away and be lost in the shadow of the trees. He stood for a minute or two looking around the room with the same expression of self-disgust, as if he hated himself and everything about him. Then he sat down again at the table, drew a few more strokes, and threw his pencil aside. Finally he walked across the floor, kicking the portmanteau out of his way, and lay down on the bed, folding his arms under his head and staring up morosely at the ceiling. Just so Charity had seen him at her side on the grass or the pine-needles, his eyes fixed on the sky, and pleasure flashing over his face like the flickers of sun the branches shed on it. But now the face was so changed that she hardly knew it, and grief at his grief gathered in her throat, rose to her eyes, and ran over. She continued to crouch on the steps, holding her breath and stiffening herself into complete immobility. One motion of her hand, one tap on the pane, and she could picture the sudden change in his face. In every pulse of her rigid body she was aware of the welcome his eyes and lips would give her, but something kept her from moving. It was not the fear of any sanction, human or heavenly. She had never in her life been afraid. It was simply that she had suddenly understood what would happen if she went in. It was the thing that did happen between young men and girls, and that North Dormer ignored in public and snickered over on the sly. It was what Miss Hatchard was still ignorant of, but every girl of Charity's class knew about before she left school. It was what had happened to Ally Hawes's sister Julia, and had ended in her going to Nettleton, and in people's never mentioning her name. It did not, of course, always end so sensationally, nor perhaps on the whole so untragically. Charity had always suspected that the shunned Julia's fate might have its compensations. There were other worse endings that the village knew of, mean, miserable, unconfessed, other lives that went on drearily without visible change, in the same cramped setting of hypocrisy. But these were not the reasons that held her back. Since the day before, she had known exactly what she would feel if Harney should take her in his arms, the melting of palm into palm and mouth on mouth, and the long flame burning her from head to foot. But mixed with this feeling was another, the wondering pride in his liking for her, the startled softness that his sympathy had put into her heart. Sometimes when her youth flushed up in her, she had imagined yielding like other girls to furtive caresses in the twilight, but she could not so cheapen herself to Harney. She did not know why he was going, but since he was going she felt she must do nothing to deface the image of her that he carried away. If he wanted her he must seek her, he must not be surprised into taking her as girls like Julia Hawes were taken. No sound came from the sleeping village, and in the deep darkness of the garden she heard now and then a secret rustle of branches, as though some night-bird brushed them. Once a footfall passed the gate, and she shrank back into her corner, but the steps died away and left a profounder quiet. Her eyes were still on Harney's tormented face. She felt she could not move till he moved. But she was beginning to grow numb from her constrained position, and at times her thoughts were so indistinct that she seemed to be held there only by a vague weight of weariness. A long time passed in this strange vigil. Harney still lay on the bed, motionless and with fixed eyes, as though following his vision to its bitter end. At last he stirred and changed his attitude slightly, and Charity's heart began to tremble. But he only flung out his arms and sank back into his former position. With a deep sigh he tossed the hair from his forehead, and then his whole body relaxed, his head turned sideways on the pillow, and she saw that he had fallen asleep. The sweet expression came back to his lips, and the haggardness faded from his face, leaving it as fresh as a boy's. She rose and crept away. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Summer, She had lost the sense of time, and did not know how late it was till she came out into the street and saw that all the windows were dark between Miss Hatchard's and the Royal House. As she passed from under the black pall of the Norway spruces, she fancied she saw two figures in the shade about the duck-pond. She drew back and watched, but nothing moved, and she had stared so long into the lamp-lit room that the darkness confused her, and she thought she must have been mistaken. She walked on, wondering whether Mr. Royal was still on the porch. In her exalted mood she did not greatly care whether he was waiting for her or not. She seemed to be floating high over life, on a great cloud of misery beneath which everyday realities had dwindled to mere specks in space. But the porch was empty. Mr. Royal's hat hung on its peg in the passage, and the kitchen lamp had been left to light her to bed. She took it and went up. The morning hours of the next day dragged by without incident. Charity had imagined that in some way or other she would learn whether Harney had already left, but Verena's deafness prevented her being a source of news, and no one came to the house who could bring enlightenment. Mr. Royal went out early, and did not return until Verena had set the table for the midday meal. When he came in he went straight to the kitchen and shouted to the old woman, "Ready for dinner!" Then he returned into the dining-room, where Charity was already seated. Harney's plate was in its usual place, but Mr. Royal offered no explanation of his absence, and Charity asked none. The feverish exaltation of the night before had dropped, and she said to herself that he had gone away indifferently, almost callously, and that now her life would lapse again into the narrow rut out of which he had lifted it. For a moment she was inclined to sneer at herself for not having used the arts that might have kept him. She sat at table till the meal was over, lest Mr. Royal should remark on her leaving, but when he stood up she rose also, without waiting to help Verena. She had her foot on the stairs when he called to her to come back. "I've got a headache. I'm going up to lie down." "I want you should come in here first. I've got something to say to you." She was sure from his tone that in a moment she would learn what every nerve in her ached to know, but as she turned back she made a last effort of indifference. Mr. Royal stood in the middle of the office, his thick eyebrows beetling, his lower jaw trembling a little. At first she thought he had been drinking, then she saw that he was sober, but stirred by a deep and stern emotion totally unlike his usual transient angers. And suddenly she understood that until then she had never really noticed him or thought about him. Except on the occasion of his one offence, he had been to her merely the person who was always there, the unquestioned central fact of life, as inevitable but as uninteresting as North Dormer itself, or any of the other conditions fate had laid on her. Even then she had regarded him only in relation to herself, and had never speculated as to his own feelings, beyond instinctively concluding that he would not trouble her again in the same way. But now she began to wonder what he was really like. He had grasped the back of his chair with both hands, and stood looking hard at her. At length he said, "Charity, for once let's you and me talk together like friends." Instantly she felt that something had happened, and that he held her in his hand. "Where is Mr. Harney? Why hasn't he come back? Have you sent him away?" she broke out, without knowing what she was saying. The change in Mr. Royal frightened her. All the blood seemed to leave his veins, and against his swarthy pallor the deep lines in his face looked black. "Didn't he have time to answer some of those questions last night? You was with him long enough," he said. Charity stood speechless. The taunt was so unrelated to what had been happening in her soul that she hardly understood it, but the instinct of self-defence awoke in her. "Who says I was with him last night?" "The whole place is saying it by now." "Then it was you that put the lie into their mouths. Oh, how I've always hated you!" she cried. She had expected a retort in kind, and it startled her to hear her exclamation sounding on through silence. "Yes, I know," Mr. Royal said slowly. "But that ain't going to help us much now."
It helps me not to care a straw what lies you tell about me."
"If they're lies, they're not my lies. My Bible oath on that, Charity. I didn't know where you were. I wasn't out of this house last night."
She made no answer, and he went on, "Is it a lie that you were seen coming out of Miss Hatchard's nigh on to midnight?" She straightened herself with a laugh, all her reckless insolence recovered. "I didn't look to see what time it was."
"You lost girl. You. Oh, my God, why did you tell me?" he broke out, dropping into his chair, his head bowed down like an old man's.
Charity's self-possession had returned with the sense of her danger. "Do you suppose I'd take the trouble to lie to you? Who are you, anyhow, to ask me where I go to when I go out at night?" Mr. Royal lifted his head and looked at her. His face had grown quiet and almost gentle, as she remembered seeing it sometimes when she was a little girl, before Mrs. Royal died.
"Don't let's go on like this, Charity. It can't do any good to either of us.
You were seen going into that fellow's house. You were seen coming out of it. I've watched this thing coming, and I've tried to stop it. As God sees me, I have. Ah, it was you, then. I knew it was you that sent him away." He looked at her in surprise.
"Didn't he tell you so? I thought he understood."
He spoke slowly, with difficult pauses.
"I didn't name you to him. I'd have cut my hand off sooner. I just told him I couldn't spare the horse any longer, and that the cooking was getting too heavy for Verena. I guess he's the kind that's heard the same thing before. Anyhow, he took it quietly enough. He said his job here was about done anyhow, and there didn't another word pass between us. If he told you otherwise, he told you an untruth."
Charity listened in a cold trance of anger. It was nothing to her what the village said, but all this fingering of her dreams. "I've told you he didn't tell me anything. I didn't speak with him last night."
"You didn't speak with him?"
"No. It's not that I care what any of you say, but you may as well know. Things ain't between us the way you think, and the other people in this place. He was kind to me, he was my friend, and all of a sudden he stopped coming, and I knew it was you that done it, you!" All her unreconciled memory of the past flamed out at him. "So I went there last night to find out what you'd said to him, that's all." Mr. Royal drew a heavy breath. "But then, if he wasn't there, what were you doing there all that time? Charity, for pity's sake tell me. I've got to know, to stop their talking." This pathetic abdication of all authority over her did not move her. She could only feel the outrage of his interference. "Can't you see that I don't care what anybody says? It's true I went there to see him, and he was in his room, and I stood outside for ever so long and watched him, but I durstn't go in for fear he'd think I'd come after him." She felt her voice breaking, and gathered it up in a last defiance. "As long as I live, I'll never forgive you!" she cried. Mr. Royal made no answer. He sat and pondered with sunken head, his veined hands clasped about the arms of his chair. Age seemed to have come down on him as winter comes on the hills after a storm. At length he looked up. "Charity, you say you don't care, but you're the proudest girl I know, and the last to want people to talk against you. You know there's always eyes watching you. You're handsomer and smarter than the rest, and that's enough. But till lately you've never given them a chance. Now they've got it, and they're going to use it. I believe what you say, but they won't. It was Mrs. Tom Fry seen you going in, and 2 or 3 of them watched for you to come out again. You've been with the fellow all day long, every day, since he come here, and I'm a lawyer, and I know how hard slander dies." He paused, but she stood motionless, without giving him any sign of acquiescence or even of attention. "He's a pleasant fellow to talk to. I liked having him here myself. The young men up here ain't had his chances. But there's one thing as old as the hills and as plain as daylight. If he'd wanted you the right way, he'd have said so." Charity did not speak. It seemed to her that nothing could exceed the bitterness of hearing such words from such lips. Mr. Royal rose from his seat. "See here, Charity Royal, I had a shameful thought once, and you've made me pay for it. Isn't that score pretty near wiped out? There's a streak in me I ain't always master of, but I've always acted straight to you but that once. And you've known I would, you've trusted me. For all your sneers and your mockery, you've always known I loved you the way a man loves a decent woman. I'm a good many years older than you, but I'm head and shoulders above this place and everybody in it, and you know that too. I slipped up once, but that's no reason for not starting again. If you'll come with me, I'll do it. If you'll marry me, we'll leave here and settle in some big town, where there's men and business and things doing. It's not too late for me to find an opening. I can see it by the way folks treat me when I go down to Hepburn or Nettleton."
Charity made no movement. Nothing in his appeal reached her heart, and she thought only of words to wound and wither. But a growing lassitude restrained her. What did anything matter that he was saying? She saw the old life closing in on her, and hardly heeded his fanciful picture of renewal.
"Charity, Charity, say you'll do it,"
she heard him urge, all his lost years and wasted passion in his voice.
"Oh, what's the use of all this? When I leave here, it won't be with you."
She moved toward the door as she spoke, and he stood up and placed himself between her and the threshold. He seemed suddenly tall and strong, as though the extremity of his humiliation had given him new vigour.
"That's all, is it? It's not much."
He leaned against the door, so towering and powerful that he seemed to fill the narrow room.
"Well then, look here. You're right. I've no claim on you. Why should you look at a broken man like me? You want the other fellow, and I don't blame you. You picked out the best when you seen it. Well, that was always my way."
He fixed his stern eyes on her, and she had the sense that the struggle within him was at its highest.
"Do you want him to marry you?" he asked.
They stood and looked at each other for a long moment, eye to eye, with the terrible equality of courage that sometimes made her feel as if she had his blood in her veins.
"Do you want him to? Say. I'll have him here in half an hour if you do. I ain't been in the law 30 years for nothing. He's hired Carrick Fry's team to take him to Hepburn, but he ain't going to start for another hour. And I can put things to him so he won't be long deciding. He's soft, I could see that. I don't say you won't be sorry afterward, but by God I'll give you the chance to be if you say so."
She heard him out in silence, too remote from all he was feeling and saying for any sally of scorn to relieve her. As she listened, there flitted through her mind the vision of Liff Hyatt's muddy boot coming down on the white bramble-flowers. The same thing had happened now. Something transient and exquisite had flowered in her, and she had stood by and seen it trampled to earth. While the thought passed through her, she was aware of Mr. Royal, still leaning against the door, but crestfallen, diminished, as though her silence were the answer he most dreaded. "I don't want any chance you can give me. I'm glad he's going away," she said. He kept his place a moment longer, his hand on the doorknob.
"Charity," he pleaded.
She made no answer, and he turned the knob and went out. She heard him fumble with the latch of the front door, and saw him walk down the steps. He passed out of the gate, and his figure, stooping and heavy, receded slowly up the street. For a while she remained where he had left her. She was still trembling with the humiliation of his last words, which rang so loud in her ears that it seemed as though they must echo through the village, proclaiming her a creature to lend herself to such vile suggestions. Her shame weighed on her like a physical oppression. The roof and walls seemed to be closing in on her, and she was seized by the impulse to get away, under the open sky, where there would be room to breathe. She went to the front door, and as she did so, Lucius Harney opened it. He looked graver and less confident than usual, and for a moment or two neither of them spoke. Then he held out his hand. "Are you going out?" he asked.
May I come in?"
Her heart was beating so violently that she was afraid to speak, and stood looking at him with tear-dilated eyes. Then she became aware of what her silence must betray, and said quickly, "Yes, come in." She led the way into the dining-room, and they sat down on opposite sides of the table, the cruet stand and japan bread-basket between them. Harney had laid his straw hat on the table, and as he sat there in his easy-looking summer clothes, a brown tie knotted under his flannel collar, and his smooth brown hair brushed back from his forehead, she pictured him as she had seen him the night before, lying on his bed, with the tossed locks falling into his eyes, and his bare throat rising out of his unbuttoned shirt. He had never seemed so remote as at the moment when that vision flashed through her mind. "I'm so sorry it's good-bye. I suppose you know I'm leaving," he began abruptly and awkwardly. She guessed that he was wondering how much she knew of his reasons for going. "I presume you found your work was over quicker than what you expected," she said. "Well, yes. That is, no. There are plenty of things I should have liked to do, but my holiday's limited, and now that Mr. Royal needs the horse for himself, it's rather difficult to find means of getting about. There ain't too many teams for hire around here," she acquiesced, and there was another silence. "These days have been awfully pleasant. I wanted to thank you for making them so," he continued, his colour rising. She could not think of any reply, and he went on, "You've been wonderfully kind to me, and I wanted to tell you, I wish I could think of you as happier, less lonely. Things are sure to change for you by and by." "Things don't change at North Dormer. People just get used to them." The answer seemed to break up the order of his prearranged consolations, and he sat looking at her uncertainly. Then he said, with his sweet smile, "That's not true of you. It can't be." The smile was like a knife thrust through her heart. Everything in her began to tremble and break loose. She felt her tears run over, and stood up. "Well, good-bye," she said. She was aware of his taking her hand, and of feeling that his touch was lifeless. "Good-bye." He turned away and stopped on the threshold. "You'll say good-bye for me to Verena?" She heard the closing of the outer door and the sound of his quick tread along the path. The latch of the gate clicked after him. The next morning, when she arose in the cold dawn and opened her shutters, she saw a freckled boy standing on the other side of the road and looking up at her. He was a boy from a farm 3 or 4 miles down the Creston road, and she wondered what he was doing there at that hour, and why he looked so hard at her window. When he saw her, he crossed over and leaned against the gate unconcernedly. There was no one stirring in the house, and she threw a shawl over her nightgown and ran down and let herself out. By the time she reached the gate, the boy was sauntering down the road, whistling carelessly, but she saw that a letter had been thrust between the slats and the crossbar of the gate. She took it out and hastened back to her room. The envelope bore her name, and inside was a leaf torn from a pocket diary. "Dear Charity, I can't go away like this. I am staying for a few days at Creston River. Will you come down and meet me at Creston Pool? I will wait for you till evening." End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Summer by Edith Wharton. Charity sat before the mirror trying on a hat which Ally Hawes, with much secrecy, had trimmed for her. It was of white straw, with a drooping brim and cherry-coloured lining that made her face glow like the inside of the shell on the parlour mantelpiece. She propped the square of looking-glass against Mr. Royal's black leather Bible, steadying it in front with a white stone on which a view of the Brooklyn Bridge was painted, and she sat before her reflection, bending the brim this way and that, while Ally Hawes's pale face looked over her shoulder like the ghost of wasted opportunities. "I look awful, don't I?" she said at last with a happy sigh. Ally smiled and took back the hat. "I'll stitch the roses on right here, so's you can put it away at once." Charity laughed and ran her fingers through her rough dark hair.
She knew that Harney liked to see its reddish edges ruffled about her forehead and breaking into little rings at the nape. She sat down on her bed and watched Ally stoop over the hat with a careful frown. "Don't you ever feel like going down to Nettleton for a day?" she asked. Ally shook her head without looking up. "No, I always remember that awful time I went down with Julia, to that doctor's." "Oh, Ally." "I can't help it. The house is on the corner of Wing Street and Lake Avenue. The trolley from the station goes right by it, and the day the minister took us down to see those pictures I recognized it right off and couldn't seem to see anything else. There's a big black sign with gold letters all across the front. Private consultations. She came as near as anything to dying." "Poor Julia," Charity sighed from the height of her purity and her security. She had a friend whom she trusted and who respected her. She was going with him to spend the next day, the 4th of July, at Nettleton. Whose business was it but hers, and what was the harm? The pity of it was that girls like Julia did not know how to choose, and to keep bad fellows at a distance. Charity slipped down from the bed and stretched out her hands. "Is it sewed? Let me try it on again." She put the hat on, smiled at her image. The thought of Julia had vanished. The next morning she was up before dawn, and saw the yellow sunrise broaden behind the hills, and the silvery lustre preceding a hot day tremble across the sleeping fields. Her plans had been made with great care. She had announced that she was going down to the Band of Hope picnic at Hepburn, and as no one else from North Dormer intended to venture so far, it was not likely that her absence from the festivity would be reported. Besides, if it were, she would not greatly care. She was determined to assert her independence, and if she stooped to fib about the Hepburn picnic, it was chiefly from the secretive instinct that made her dread the profanation of her happiness. Whenever she was with Lucius Harney, she would have liked some impenetrable mountain mist to hide her. It was arranged that she should walk to a point of the Creston Road where Harney was to pick her up and drive her across the hills to Hepburn in time for the 9:30 train to Nettleton. Harney at first had been rather lukewarm about the trip. He declared himself ready to take her to Nettleton, but urged her not to go on the 4th of July, on account of the crowds, the probable lateness of the trains, the difficulty of her getting back before night. But her evident disappointment caused him to give way, and even to affect a faint enthusiasm for the adventure. She understood why he was not more eager. He must have seen sights beside which even a 4th of July at Nettleton would seem tame. But she had never seen anything, and a great longing possessed her to walk the streets of a big town on a holiday, clinging to his arm and jostled by idle crowds in their best clothes. The only cloud on the prospect was the fact that the shops would be closed, but she hoped he would take her back another day, when they were open. She started out unnoticed in the early sunlight, slipping through the kitchen while Verena bent above the stove. To avoid attracting notice, she carried her new hat carefully wrapped up, and had thrown a long grey veil of Mrs. Royal's over the new white muslin dress which Ally's clever fingers had made for her. All of the $10 Mr. Royal had given her, and a part of her own savings as well, had been spent on renewing her wardrobe, and when Harney jumped out of the buggy to meet her, she read her reward in his eyes. The freckled boy who had brought her the note 2 weeks earlier was to wait with the buggy at Hepburn till their return. He perched at Charity's feet, his legs dangling between the wheels, and they could not say much because of his presence. But it did not greatly matter, for their past was now rich enough to have given them a private language, and with the long day stretching before them like the blue distance beyond the hills, there was a delicate pleasure in postponement. When Charity, in response to Harney's message, had gone to meet him at the Creston Pool, her heart had been so full of mortification and anger that his first words might easily have estranged her. But it happened that he had found the right word, which was one of simple friendship. His tone had instantly justified her, and put her guardian in the wrong. He had made no allusion to what had passed between Mr. Royal and himself, but had simply let it appear that he had left because means of conveyance were hard to find at North Dormer, and because Creston River was a more convenient centre.
He told her that he had hired by the week the buggy of the freckled boy's father, who served as livery-stable keeper to one or two melancholy summer boarding-houses on Creston Lake, and had discovered, within driving distance, a number of houses worthy of his pencil, and he said that he could not, while he was in the neighbourhood, give up the pleasure of seeing her as often as possible. When they took leave of each other, she promised to continue to be his guide, and during the fortnight which followed they roamed the hills in happy comradeship. In most of the village friendships between youths and maidens lack of conversation was made up for by tentative fondling, but Harney, except when he had tried to comfort her in her trouble on their way back from the Hyatts, had never put his arm about her, or sought to betray her into any sudden caress. It seemed to be enough for him to breathe her nearness like a flower's, and since his pleasure at being with her, and his sense of her youth and her grace, perpetually shone in his eyes and softened the inflections of his voice, his reserve did not suggest coldness, but the deference due to a girl of his own class. The buggy was drawn by an old trotter who whirled them along so briskly that the pace created a little breeze, but when they reached Hepburn, the full heat of the airless morning descended on them. At the railway station the platform was packed with a sweltering throng, and they took refuge in the waiting-room, where there was another throng, already dejected by the heat and the long waiting for retarded trains. Pale mothers were struggling with fretful babies, or trying to keep their older offspring from the fascination of the track. Girls and their fellows were giggling and shoving, and passing about candy in sticky bags, and older men, collarless and perspiring, were shifting heavy children from one arm to the other, and keeping a haggard eye on the scattered members of their families. At last the train rumbled in, and engulfed the waiting multitude. Harney swept Charity up onto the first car, and they captured a bench for two, and sat in happy isolation while the train swayed and roared along through rich fields and languid tree-clumps. The haze of the morning had become a sort of clear tremor over everything, like the colourless vibration about a flame, and the opulent landscape seemed to droop under it. But to Charity the heat was a stimulant. It enveloped the whole world in the same glow that burned at her heart. Now and then a lurch of the train flung her against Harney, and through her thin muslin she felt the touch of his sleeve. She steadied herself, their eyes met, and the flaming breath of the day seemed to enclose them. The train roared into the Nettleton station, the descending mob caught them on its tide, and they were swept out into a vague dusty square, thronged with seedy hacks and long-curtained omnibuses drawn by horses with tasselled fly-nets over their withers, who stood swinging their depressed heads drearily from side to side. A mob of bus and hack drivers were shouting, "To the Eagle House! To the Washington House! This way to the lake! Just starting for Greytop!" And through their yells came the popping of firecrackers, the explosion of torpedoes, the banging of toy guns, and the crash of a fireman's band trying to play the Merry Widow while they were being packed into a wagonette streaming with bunting. The ramshackle wooden hotels about the square were all hung with flags and paper lanterns, and as Harney and Charity turned into the main street, with its brick and granite business blocks crowding out the old low-storied shops, and its towering poles strung with innumerable wires that seemed to tremble and buzz in the heat, they saw the double line of flags and lanterns tapering away gaily to the park at the other end of the perspective. The noise and colour of this holiday vision seemed to transform Nettleton into a metropolis. Charity could not believe that Springfield or even Boston had anything grander to show, and she wondered if, at this very moment, Annabel Balch, on the arm of as brilliant a young man, were threading their way through scenes as resplendent. "Where shall we go first?" Harney asked, but as she turned her happy eyes on him he guessed the answer, and said, "We'll take a look around, shall we?" The street swarmed with their fellow travellers, with other excursionists arriving from other directions, with Nettleton's own population, and with the mill hands trooping in from the factories on the Creston. The shops were closed, but one would scarcely have noticed it, so numerous were the glass doors swinging open on saloons, on restaurants, on drug-stores gushing from every soda-water tap, on fruit and confectionery shops stacked with strawberry cake, cocoanut drops, trays of glistening molasses candy, boxes of caramels and chewing gum,
baskets of sodden strawberries, and dangling branches of bananas. Outside of some of the doors were trestles with banked-up oranges and apples, spotted pears and dusty raspberries, and the air reeked with the smell of fruit and stale coffee, beer and sarsaparilla and fried potatoes. Even the shops that were closed offered, through wide expanses of plate glass, hints of hidden riches. In some, waves of silk and ribbon broke over shores of imitation moss from which ravishing hats rose like tropical orchids. In others, the pink throats of gramophones opened their giant convolutions into a soundless chorus, or bicycles shining in neat ranks seemed to await the signal of an invisible starter, or tiers of fancy goods in leatherette and paste and celluloid dangled their insidious graces, and in one vast bay that seemed to project them into exciting contact with the public, wax ladies in daring dresses chatted elegantly, or, with gestures intimate yet blameless, pointed to their pink corsets and transparent hosiery. Presently Harney found that his watch had stopped, and turned in at a small jeweller's shop which chanced to still be open. While the watch was being examined, Charity leaned over the glass counter, where, on a background of dark blue velvet, pins, rings, and brooches glittered like the moon and stars. She had never seen jewellery so near by, and she longed to lift the glass lid and plunge her hand among the shining treasures. But already Harney's watch was repaired, and he laid his hand on her arm and drew her from her dream. "Which do you like best?" he asked, leaning over the counter at her side. "I don't know." She pointed to a gold lily of the valley with white flowers. "Don't you think the blue pins better?" he suggested, and immediately she saw that the lily of the valley was mere trumpery compared to the small round stone, blue as a mountain lake, with little sparks of light all round it. She coloured at her want of discrimination. "It's so lovely, I guess I was afraid to look at it," she said. He laughed, and they went out of the shop, but a few steps away he exclaimed, "Oh, by Jove, I forgot something," and turned back and left her in the crowd. She stood staring down a row of pink gramophone throats, till he rejoined her and slipped his arm through hers. "You mustn't be afraid of looking at the blue pin any longer, because it belongs to you," he said, and she felt a little box being pressed into her hand. Her heart gave a leap of joy, but it reached her lips only in a shy stammer. She remembered other girls whom she had heard planning to extract presents from their fellows, and was seized with a sudden dread lest Harney should have imagined that she had leaned over the pretty things in the glass case in the hope of having one given to her. A little farther down the street they turned in at a glass doorway opening on a shining hall with a mahogany staircase and brass cages in its corners. "We must have something to eat," Harney said, and the next moment Charity found herself in a dressing-room all looking-glass and lustrous surfaces, where a party of showy-looking girls were dabbing on powder and straightening immense plumed hats. When they had gone, she took courage to bathe her hot face in one of the marble basins and to straighten her own hat-brim, which the parasols of the crowd had indented. The dresses in the shops had so impressed her that she scarcely dared look at her reflection, but when she did so, the glow of her face under her cherry-coloured hat, and the curve of her young shoulders through the transparent muslin, restored her courage, and when she had taken the blue brooch from its box and pinned it on her bosom, she walked toward the restaurant with her head high, as if she had always strolled through tessellated halls beside young men in flannels. Her spirits sank a little at the sight of the slim-waisted waitresses in black, with bewitching mob-caps on their haughty heads, who were moving disdainfully between the tables. "Not for another hour," one of them dropped to Harney in passing, and he stood doubtfully glancing about him. "Oh, well, we can't stay sweltering here," he decided. "Let's try somewhere else." And with a sense of relief, Charity followed him from that scene of inhospitable splendour. That somewhere else turned out, after more hot tramping and several failures, to be, of all things, a little open-air place in a back street that called itself a French restaurant, and consisted in 2 or 3 rickety tables under a scarlet runner between a patch of zinnias and petunias and a big elm bending over from the next yard. Here they lunched on queerly flavoured things, while Harney, leaning back in a crippled rocking-chair, smoked cigarettes between the courses, and poured into Charity's glass a pale yellow wine which he said was the very same one drank in just such jolly places in France. Charity did not think the wine as good as sarsaparilla, but she sipped a mouthful for the pleasure of doing what he did, and of fancying herself alone with him in foreign countries. The illusion was increased by their being served by a deep-bosomed woman with smooth hair and a pleasant laugh, who talked to Harney in unintelligible words, and seemed amazed and overjoyed at his answering her in kind. At the other tables other people sat, mill hands probably, homely but pleasant-looking, who spoke the same shrill jargon, and looked at Harney and Charity with friendly eyes, and between the table legs a poodle with bald patches and pink eyes nosed about for scraps, and sat up on his hind legs absurdly. Harney showed no inclination to move, for hot as their corner was, it was at least shaded and quiet, and from the main thoroughfares came the clanging of trolleys, the incessant popping of torpedoes, the jingle of street organs, the bawling of megaphone men, and the loud murmur of increasing crowds. He leaned back, smoking his cigar, patting the dog, and stirring the coffee that steamed in their chipped cups. "It's the real thing, you know," he explained, and Charity hastily revised her previous conception of the beverage. They had made no plans for the rest of the day, and when Harney asked her what she wanted to do next, she was too bewildered by rich possibilities to find an answer. Finally she confessed that she longed to go to the lake, where she had not been taken on her former visit, and when he answered, "Oh, there's time for that. It will be pleasanter later," she suggested seeing some pictures like the ones Mr. Miles had taken her to. She thought Harney looked a little disconcerted, but he passed his fine handkerchief over his warm brow, said gaily, "Come along, then," and rose with a last pat for the pink-eyed dog. Mr. Miles's pictures had been shown in an austere YMCA hall with white walls and an organ, but Harney led Charity to a glittering place, everything she saw seemed to glitter, where they passed between immense pictures of yellow-haired beauties stabbing villains in evening dress, into a velvet-curtained auditorium packed with spectators to the last limit of compression. After that, for a while, everything was merged in her brain in swimming circles of heat and blinding alternations of light and darkness. All the world has to show seemed to pass before her in a chaos of palms and minarets, charging cavalry regiments, roaring lions, comic policemen, and scowling murderers, and the crowd around her, the hundreds of hot, sallow, candy-munching faces, young, old, middle-aged, but all kindled with the same contagious excitement, became part of the spectacle, and danced on the screen with the rest. Presently the thought of the cool trolley run to the lake grew irresistible, and they struggled out of the theatre. As they stood on the pavement, Harney pale with the heat, and even Charity a little confused by it, a young man drove by in an electric runabout with a calico band bearing the words, $10 to take you round the lake. Before Charity knew what was happening, Harney had waved a hand, and they were climbing in. "Say, for 25 I'll run you out to see the ball game and back," the driver proposed with an insinuating grin, but Charity said quickly, "Oh, I'd rather go rowing on the lake." The street was so thronged that progress was slow, but the glory of sitting in the little carriage while it wriggled its way between laden omnibuses and trolleys made the moments seem too short. "Next turn is Lake Avenue," the young man called out over his shoulder, and as they paused in the wake of a big omnibus groaning with knights of Pythias in cocked hats and swords, Charity looked up and saw on the corner a brick house with a conspicuous black and gold sign across its front. Dr. Merkel, private consultations at all hours, lady attendance, she read, and suddenly she remembered Allie Hawes's words. The house was at the corner of Wing Street and Lake Avenue. There's a big black sign across the front. Through all the heat and the rapture, a shiver of cold ran over her. End of chapter 9.